Silas Harrow did not hesitate. That was the part that would stay with Elowen for years afterward, not the cold, not the pain screaming up through her shattered ankle, not even the snow beginning to fall in fat, in different flakes across the mountain pass. It was the fact that her father looked at her, really looked at her, assessed the situation the way a man assesses a lame horse on a bad trail, and simply decided. "We can't carry her," he said. "Not through that pass. Not with the storm coming." Her mother made a sound half sob, half protest, and Silas turned on her with a look that killed the noise dead in her throat. Dawson, Elowen's older brother, a man of 26 who had once claimed he would fight bears for his little sister, stood with his hands shoved in his coat pockets and stared at a point somewhere above her head. They left her a blanket, one blanket, and a tin cup. Then Silas Harrow climbed back onto the wagon seat, snapped the reins, and drove away through the falling snow without looking back once. Not once. If this story already has you gripping your seat, you haven't seen anything yet. Every part of Elowen's journey is going to pull you deeper into the cold, into the fight, into something neither she nor the man who finds her ever expected. Subscribe to this channel right now and hit the bell so you don't miss a single piece of what's coming. And while you're here, drop a like and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The wagon sounds disappeared faster than they should have. Sound did strange things in the mountains, bounced off rock faces, got swallowed by pines, died in pockets of cold air, and Elowen kept thinking she heard the creak of the axle, the hollow knock of the wooden wheels against frozen ruts, for several minutes after the last shape of the wagon dissolved into white. She told herself it was real. She told herself they had stopped just ahead, just out of sight around that bend in the trail, that her father was having second thoughts, that Dawson was climbing down even now. Coming back through the snow, with his long legs covering the ground fast, the way he used to run across their father's fields in Ohio when they were children. She waited. The sound she'd been holding on to wasn't the wagon anymore. It was just wind. She was 23 years old, and she was going to die on this mountain, and the people who had left her here were her blood. Her ankle had been crushed 2 days before, when the front wheel of the wagon dropped into a hidden gully and the whole rig lurched sideways, pitching her off the bench. She'd hit wrong, she knew it, the instant she landed. That particular quality of pain that was different from bruising or spraining. That deep structural wrongness that made the leg feel like it belonged to someone else. Her father had splinted it with 2 pieces of barrel stave and wrapped it tight with strips cut from an old flour sack. And she'd ridden the last 30 miles in the wagon bed with her teeth locked together, not complaining, not asking for anything. Because Silas Harrow had made it abundantly clear since Ohio that this journey west was an investment, not a holiday, and weakness was a cost he hadn't budgeted for. She hadn't known until this morning just how seriously he'd meant that. The snow was coming down steadily now, not the pretty kind, not the slow, theatrical flakes of Christmas, but the hard-driven, horizontal kind that found every gap in clothing and worked its way to skin with quiet efficiency. Elowen pulled the single blanket tighter and tried to think practically. Her father had left her beside a creek. She could hear it even now, the low muttering sound of water moving under ice. There was a stand of pines about 15 yards to her left, which would offer some windbreak. The ground under the snow was rock and frozen dirt, not good, but the pine needles had built up a shallow mat against the base of the largest tree. She tried to stand. The pain that went through her ankle when she put weight on it was so complete and so sudden that she actually laughed, a short, shocked sound that had nothing funny in it. Her vision went white at the edges. She grabbed the nearest branch and hung on until her heart stopped hammering and her vision came back. And then she dragged herself, because that's what it was, dragging on her hands and one good knee toward those pines. It took 20 minutes to cover 15 yards. When she got there, she pressed her back against the rough bark and looked at the trail. Empty, white, filling in steadily with new snow. She could already barely make out the wagon ruts. She thought about her mother. Margaret Harrow was not a strong woman, not in the way Elowen had always quietly wished she were. She was gentle and soft-spoken and had a talent for finding the one small beautiful thing in any bad situation, which was a lovely quality in a person and a useless one in a crisis. She had protested. Elowen had heard her, the high-strained sound of her voice from the wagon bed, saying, Silas, Silas, we cannot do this. She is our daughter. And Silas had said something back that Elowen couldn't make out, low and final, and then there had been quiet. And then there had been wagon wheels. Elowen had watched her mother's face from the ground as the wagon passed. Margaret had been looking straight ahead, both hands pressed flat against her thighs, her jaw so tight the muscles stood out like cords. She had not looked down at her daughter in the snow. Maybe that was how she'd managed it. Elowen stopped thinking about her mother. It didn't help anything, and she needed everything she had left for the business of staying alive. She took inventory. 1 blanket, moderately thick wool, damp already at the edges. 1 tin cup, empty. The clothes she was wearing, a wool dress, a heavy coat that had been her grandmother's and was 2 sizes too large, wool stockings, leather boots. The boot on her bad foot was laced only to mid-calf because her ankle had swelled so badly that seeing it higher had been impossible. She had no food. She had no fire-starting materials. The flint had been in her traveling bag, which was still in the wagon. She had no weapon. She had a creak she could hear but not reach. She had trees that would slow the wind but not stop it. She had, if she was being honest with herself, maybe 4 or 5 hours before the cold became something she couldn't fight anymore. She pulled the tin cup out from where she'd tucked it under the blanket and set it at the edge of the pine's canopy, where the snow could collect in it. Water, at least. That was something. Then she pulled the blanket up around her ears, pressed herself as tight to the tree as she could get, and started counting her breaths. She'd read once in some almanac her father had brought home when she was 12, one of the few books the Harrow household had ever owned, that breathing slowly used less body heat. She didn't know if that was true. She counted anyway. 1, 2, 3. She had been counting for what felt like an hour, though it was probably closer to 20 minutes, because cold did terrible things to time when she heard the sound. Not wind, not the creak, not the settling crack of ice. Footsteps. Heavy ones. Deliberate. Moving through snow without any particular attempt at quiet. The way a person moved when they weren't afraid of anything on this mountain and had no reason to be. Elowen's first instinct was pure animal relief. Someone is coming. Someone will find me, followed immediately by a cold second thought that had nothing to do with the temperature. She was a young woman, alone, on a mountain trail, in a snowstorm, with no way to run and no way to fight. She shrank back against the tree and tried to make herself smaller, which was pointless because the pine's shadow only reached so far, and the blanket was a dark shape against the snow, obvious as a signpost. The footsteps stopped. Then a man's voice, low and rough as gravel, said, "You're not dead yet." It wasn't a question. It wasn't relief. It was just an observation, delivered with the same flat practicality someone might use to note that it was still snowing or that the trail was icy. Elowen looked up. The man standing at the edge of the tree's shadow was enormous, not fat, but built on that seemed wrong for an ordinary human being. Shoulders so wide they blocked a full section of the gray sky behind him, a coat of beaver hide and rough-sewn wool that made him look even larger. He had a beard so thick it was hard to see where it ended and his collar began. His face, what she could see of it, was a map of scars, one running from his left eye down to his jaw, another crossing his chin, a third puckering the skin of his neck, where something had clearly tried to open his throat and nearly succeeded. He was carrying a rifle as casually as another man might carry a walking stick, and at his belt was a knife with a blade long enough to be genuinely alarming. He was looking at her with pale gray eyes that held absolutely no readable emotion. "You're not dead yet," he said again, as if testing the statement. "Not yet," Elowen said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. He studied her for another moment. Then his gaze dropped to her leg, to the obvious way she was holding it, to the unnatural angle of the ankle, even through the boot, and something moved across his face that was too brief and too subtle to name. "Wagon people?" he asked. She paused. "They had to keep moving. The pass, I saw their tracks." He said it without inflection, without judgment and without sympathy either, just information. "Storm's going to close this trail in 2 hours, maybe 3. She waited. She didn't know what she was waiting for. She didn't know what she wanted him to do. She only knew that her teeth were starting to chatter and her foot had stopped hurting, which she knew from the almanac was a very bad sign. The man named Garrick Voss, though she didn't know his name yet, wouldn't know it for another hour, looked at her for a long moment. Then he leaned his rifle against the nearest pine, stripped off his outer coat without any ceremony, dropped it around her shoulders, picked up the rifle again, and bent down. "Hold still," he said. "I'm going to lift you. I don't need." "Your foot's going numb." He said it like a correction, not an argument. "You've got maybe an hour before the nerves start dying. And my cabin's 40 minutes from here." She opened her mouth to say something she wasn't sure what, some final assertion of dignity or self-sufficiency, and then the cold hit her properly for the first time, the kind of cold that gets into your chest and starts squeezing, and she closed her mouth again. She let him lift her. He was not gentle exactly. He was careful. There was a difference. He handled her the way a man handles something that matters and can be damaged, with attention and without unnecessary gentleness, which would have been condescending. When her bad ankle swung and hit his arm and she hissed through her teeth, he immediately adjusted his grip, not apologizing, just correcting, and started walking. He walked fast through the snow, not running, but eating up ground with long strides that should have jostled her constantly, but somehow didn't. He had a way of moving that absorbed the terrain rather than fighting it, shifting his weight before the foot hit, so the motion was almost hypnotic. Elowen gripped the beaver hide coat with both hands and concentrated on breathing. "What's your name?" she asked, mostly because silence felt dangerous, the kind of silence that let sleep creep in. "Garrick." "Garrick what?" "Voss." She waited to see if he'd ask for hers. He didn't. "Elowen," she offered anyway, "Elowen Harrow." He said nothing, but he did adjust his grip slightly, more of her weight going to his right arm, so his left hand was more free. She noticed this, filed it away. Understood that it was in case he needed to bring the rifle up fast and didn't want her in the way of the shot. It was a practical adjustment made by someone accustomed to moving through terrain where things could go wrong quickly. Not reassuring exactly, but honest. She fell asleep somewhere in the last 10 minutes. When she woke up, there was fire. Not the distant, cheerful fire of a campsite, but the close, brutal fire of a hearth in a small cabin, radiating heat so intense after the cold that her skin felt like it was burning from the outside in. She was on a cot against the wall, still in her clothes but with the beaver coat replaced by 2 heavy wool blankets. And her bad ankle, she could feel this even before she looked, had been freed from the boot and re-splinted with something better than barrel stave. Thin flat boards, smooth, lashed with strips of rawhide that were snug but not cutting. Garrick was sitting at a table 6 feet away, eating something from a tin bowl. He did not look up when she moved. "You re-splinted it," she said. The barrel stave was sitting wrong. Bone was pushing. He took another spoonful. "You probably lost some time on healing by traveling on it. Might not set true." She looked at the ankle. She already knew what might not set true meant for a woman who needed to walk to be useful. She pushed that thought aside for now. "How long was I out?" "Since I picked you up, about 2 hours. The storm. Pass is closed." He still hadn't looked at her. "Won't open again until spring. Maybe March, maybe April." She let that settle. "Then I don't have any money." Didn't ask for any. "I can't," she started, meaning to say she couldn't impose, couldn't stay, had to find another way, but stopped because every single alternative she could construct ended with her dead in the snow, and she was too cold and too tired for polite fiction. Garrick finally looked up. His pale eyes were direct and completely uninterested in whatever she'd been about to say. "You'll stay until the pass opens. Then I'll take you to the settlement in the valley. And until then you heal." She waited for the condition. There was always a condition. He went back to his bowl. No condition came. She lay back against the cot and stared at the low cabin ceiling, rough-hewn logs, dark with years of smoke, one spot near the chimney where water had come in sometime in the past and left a brown stain shaped vaguely like a bird in flight. She was not safe. She knew that in some sensible part of her brain she was in an isolated cabin in a Montana blizzard with a man she didn't know who had more scars than she'd ever seen on a human face and who communicated in sentences of 3 words or fewer. But she was warm, and for the first time in 2 days, nobody was calculating her worth against the weight they'd have to carry. She slept again almost immediately, and this time it was not the dangerous sliding away of hypothermia but actual sleep, solid and deep, the kind that meant her body believed it was going to live. She woke up at some point in the night and lay still for a moment listening. The storm was hitting the cabin hard. She could hear it, in the way the walls creaked, in the sound of wind, finding every crack and testing it. Outside, the temperature was probably dropping toward lethal. Inside, the fire was low but steady, and across the room in a bunk on the opposite wall, Garrick Voss was a large still shape under dark blankets. He'd given her the cot, she realized. He was sleeping in his own bunk, which was obviously where he normally slept, and he had moved himself and his blankets to give her the better one near the fire. She thought about that for a long time in the dark. She thought about her father's face when he'd made his decision. The particular quality of his expression not cruel, she'd realized even in the moment, not enjoying it, but just finished. As if a calculation had concluded and he was merely implementing the result. She had been a variable in his planning, and she'd come up negative, and he'd acted accordingly. She thought about Dawson's hands in his pockets, his deliberate blindness. She thought about her mother's rigid jaw and forward-facing eyes. And then, against her will, she thought about what Garrick Voss had said, not with kindness, not with warmth, not with any of the softness she might have wished for from a rescuer, but with simple, unremarkable certainty. Hold still, I'm going to lift you, as if the decision were obvious, as if there had never been any other option. She didn't cry. She thought she might, lying there in the warm dark with the storm hammering the walls, but she didn't. She pressed her lips together and breathed slowly and let the fire's warmth work into her bones, and she made herself a promise that had nothing to do with gratitude or debt or the man sleeping 6 feet away. She was never going to be left behind again, not because of weakness, not because of helplessness, not because she was more trouble than she was worth. Whatever it cost her, whatever she had to learn, to become, to endure, she was going to be someone who couldn't be left. The fire popped. A log shifted and settled. Outside, the mountain howled its indifference. Inside, Elowen Harrow made her plan. She started the next morning. Garrick was already gone when she woke out to check his nearest trap line. She assumed from the emptiness of the cabin and the fresh tracks in the thin strip of snow visible through the window. He had left food, a pot of something near the fire, thick and hot, venison or rabbit she couldn't tell, and a heel of hard bread on the table. She ate standing up, leaning against the table edge with all her weight on her good leg, because sitting felt like giving in. Then she looked around the cabin. It was a single room, roughly 16 by 20 feet, built with the particular functional intelligence of someone who'd thought hard about living alone in a small space for a long time. The cot where she'd slept was against the south wall near the fireplace. His bunk was on the north wall. Between them, a work table, 2 chairs, a set of rough shelves holding tin goods and tools, and various items she couldn't immediately identify. In the far corner, a second, lower set of shelves held trapping equipment traps in various stages of repair, coils of wire, tools she didn't know the names of. There was a broom propped by the door, a water barrel with a wooden lid, and hooks on the wall holding a collection of coats, rope, and what appeared to be a spare pair of snowshoes. No decoration, no softness, no evidence of anyone who'd been in this cabin except Garrick Voss alone, for what looked like a very long time. She looked at the broom. She looked at her ankle. She hobbled to the broom 6 feet, which took a careful, humiliating minute, picked it up, and reversed it, handle down, testing the length. The handle hit the floor about 6 inches in front of her, and came to roughly her shoulder. Close enough, she took 1 step, then another. The ankle screamed, but it was a different kind of screaming from the day before. Not the deep structural wrongs, but the sharp protest of something that didn't want to be used yet, and was being used anyway. She could work with that. She'd worked with worse. She crossed the cabin. It took her 15 minutes, and by the end her whole body was shaking, but she crossed it, touched the north wall, and stood there for a moment breathing. Then she turned around and went back. When Garrick came through the door 2 hours later, she was standing at the fireplace stirring the pot. He stopped in the doorway. The broth was sitting, she said, not turning around. It would have burned if I'd left it. She heard him set down whatever he was carrying. Heard the deliberate sound of someone carefully not saying what they were thinking. You should be on the cot, he said finally. I'm fine. Your ankle is healing. She turned around. The broom was propped against the fireplace in plain sight, its purpose as a crutch obvious. She met his eyes steadily. If I stay on that cot, I'll lose the muscle above the brake, and it'll take twice as long to be useful again. I need to move. He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him working through the argument, or maybe working through the decision not to have the argument. His jaw shifted slightly, the only readable movement on his face. Don't put full weight on it, he said at last. I'm not. He hung up his coat. He washed his hands in the basin. He sat down at the table and started working on something from his pack without another word about it. She turned back to the fire. Small victory. First of many needed. She was in Garrick Voss's cabin for 6 weeks before anything resembling a real conversation passed between them, and she would later look back on those 6 weeks and recognize them as the most deliberately educational period of her life. Every day she pushed a little further. Every day she learned something new, not from Garrick directly, because he wasn't a man who explained things, but by watching him with the focused attention of someone who understood that information was survival, and that every task he performed without thinking about it was a task she needed to be able to perform too. She learned how to bank the fire correctly so it would hold heat through the night without burning through all the wood. She learned which of the tinned goods on the shelves were for eating and which were preserves to be opened only in specific circumstances. She learned through one near disaster that she never told him about that the water barrel had a crack near the base that needed to be checked weekly, or it would leak into the floor and freeze the planks. She fixed it herself with pine pitch and a strip of hide she found in his spare equipment, and when he noticed, 3 days later, that the floor wasn't doing the thing it had been doing, he looked at the barrel, looked at her, and said nothing. She was getting better at reading his silences. That one meant something close to approval. In the evenings, when the light failed and they were both indoors, he would work at the table and she would sit near the fire with whatever task she'd found for herself, mending a hide that needed stitching, cleaning a rusted trap component he'd tossed aside, doing the slow, painful stretching exercises on her ankle that she'd worked out from logic and pain response. He never asked what she was doing. She never explained. But he started leaving things near her chair. Small things. A piece of stubborn leather that needed softening. A length of rope that needed a particular knot retied. Items that, if she chose to address them, and if she didn't, he would get to eventually. It was, she came to understand, the only way Garrick Voss knew how to offer something without the vulnerability of actually offering it. The first real conversation, the kind where more than 2 sentences passed in sequence, happened on a night in late January when the cold had locked down so hard the air inside the cabin had a visible quality to it, a faint haze that wasn't quite frost, but was something the fire was working hard against. He'd come in from the far trap line, which was a full day's walk, and he was tired in a way she could see in his shoulders and the way he moved, not defeated but emptied out, the kind of tired that lives in the muscles and not the mind. She'd made food real food, not just reheated broth, but a proper stew from the last of the fresh venison and the dried herbs she'd found in one of the tins and carefully rationed. She'd been working on it most of the afternoon, adjusting what she was learning about the fire's heat and the pot's thickness. She put a bowl on the table without comment, as if this were ordinary, and went back to her chair. He sat down and ate. After a while, he said, "This is different. I used the herbs, the tin behind the others. I know what tin." He was quiet for another moment. "My wife used those. A long time ago." It was the most personal thing he had said to her in 6 weeks. She didn't move, didn't react in any visible way, because she understood instinctively that the wrong response would close this off completely. "She was a good cook?" Elowen asked. "She was a good woman." He pushed the empty bowl a fraction of an inch to the left, a small fidget. "Died of fever 7 years ago. I'm sorry. Yeah." He was quiet again. "Then, you ever been married?" "No, but you were heading west with your family." He said it without inflection, but there was a question folded inside it. "My father had a land claim," she said. "He needed help to work it. I was coming to help. And your ankle changed that calculation." It wasn't a cruel observation. It was just accurate. She'd thought enough about it in the past 6 weeks that the accuracy didn't sting anymore, or not as much. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He turned back to the table and picked up the piece of harness he'd been repairing and went back to work. But something had shifted. A small crack in the wall between them, not large but real. In the following days, she noticed that his silences carried different textures, some of them still flat and empty, but others thoughtful, like a man turning something over in his mind. And occasionally, when she said something in observation about the fire, a question about one of his tools, a flat complaint about the broom handle being the wrong diameter for proper grip, he would look up, and something that might, generously, be called amusement would move across his face. Not a smile, just an easing of the set of his jaw. It was February when she finally asked about the scarring. She hadn't planned to. She'd been careful, actually, not to look directly at his face too long, because she knew that kind of attention was uncomfortable for anyone. And because she'd noticed that strangers tended to stare at the scars with a quality of horrified fascination that clearly hardened something behind his eyes. But they were working close together that day. She'd asked to learn how to maintain the traps, partly because it was useful, and partly because she was running out of things in the cabin to improve, and she was watching his hands on the metal components, and her eyes moved up, and she just asked, "What happened to your face?" He didn't freeze, didn't bristle. He just kept working for a moment and said, "Bear." Mostly. That one he touched the long scar from his eye to jaw was a man. Long time ago, the man tried to take my cabin. He turned a trap component in his hands, checking the spring. He didn't, simple as that. She looked at the scar more carefully, the particular angle of it, the depth, and understood that it had been made by something with a significant reach, and that Garrick Voss had survived it, which said something about both the fight and the man. "It doesn't bother you?" she asked. "That I looked?" He glanced up. "You looked like you were calculating something." "Not like you were disgusted. I was calculating something." "I know." He handed her a trap spring to check. "That's why it doesn't bother me." She held the spring in both hands and tested its resistance, the way she'd watched him do. It was harder to compress than she'd expected. Her hands weren't strong enough yet to do it cleanly. She made a mental note to work on that. The pass began showing early signs of thawing in late February, a week before Garrick had predicted. He mentioned it one evening, in his usual way, no preamble, just the information, trail softening. Give it another 3 weeks, maybe 4. She absorbed this. "You said you'd take me to the valley." "I will." She looked at the fire. "And then you find a way forward," he paused. "There's work in the valley. The settlement's grown. You could find something." "Something," she said. He heard the weight she put on the word. She could tell from the way he didn't immediately respond. "You've got more skills than you came here with," he said finally. "Cabin work, preservation, the traps," another pause. "You're not helpless." "I know I'm not helpless." She said it without heat, because it was a fact and not an argument. "I also know that a woman with a limp, alone, in a frontier settlement with no family and no money, has a very specific set of options. And I'm not interested in most of them." The fire popped. Outside for once, it was relatively quiet, the wind had dropped, and the night was very still. Garrick was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I need someone who can manage the cabin when I'm on the far lines. Someone who can keep the preserves, maintain the equipment, handle problems that come up." He was still looking at the table. "I've done 6 winters alone. It works. But it's not efficient." He said the word carefully, like he'd chosen it deliberately over several other words. "Last winter, I lost 3 days of trap time because I came back to a problem I could have had handled if there'd been someone here." She looked at him. "You're describing a business arrangement." "I'm describing what I need." He met her eyes. "What do you need?" She thought about it honestly. She needed security. She needed never to be in the position again where her survival depended on someone else's calculation of her value. She needed a place where she wasn't a variable to be assessed and discarded. "A home," she said, "and someone who doesn't see my ankle first." He nodded slowly. "I see the ankle. I just don't care about it the way other people do. What I saw first when I found you." He stopped, seemed to decide to finish. "You dragged yourself 15 yards to those trees. With a bad break. In the snow." He looked at her steadily. "That's not a woman who needs someone to carry her. That's a woman who needed a reason not to die." Her throat did something she wasn't prepared for. She looked at the fire. "What are you proposing?" she said, when she could keep her voice even. "Marriage." He said it the same way he said everything, flat, direct, with no decoration. "Legal if you want, or whatever the valley can arrange." "For practical reasons." "Yes, not for—" She stopped. "No," he said. Then after a beat, "Not yet." She sat with that for a long moment. It was the most honest proposal she had ever heard or expected to hear. No poetry, no false promises, no performance of feelings he didn't have. Just, "Here is what I need. Here's what I'm offering. What are you going to do with that?" "I have one condition," she said. "What?" "Equal." She looked at him directly. "Not your wife in the way that means your possession. Not someone you protect and manage and make decisions for. Equal. I make decisions about this place too. I have opinions about how things are run. If I think you're wrong about something, I say so." He looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read his expression. Fully, he was never easy to read, but she thought she saw something in his eyes that was close to relief. As if she'd said the precise thing he'd needed to hear and hadn't known how to ask for. "Equal," he said. "Yes." She put out her hand. He looked at it for a half-second. A brief surprise, she thought, at the formality of it, or perhaps at the directness, and then he reached across the table and shook it. His hand was enormous and rough and warm, and the grip was firm without being demonstrative. It was the most honest agreement she had ever made. Outside the cabin walls, the Montana winter was beginning very slowly, almost imperceptibly, to loosen its grip on the mountain. Inside, two people who had both, in different ways, been left behind by the world they'd come from, shook hands across a rough table in firelight, and started over. The handshake across the table was not a romantic moment. That was the thing Elowen would remember most clearly about it afterward, how completely unromantic it was. How it felt less like the beginning of something, and more like the signing of a contract between two people who had both been burned badly enough by soft promises to want something harder and more specific instead. Garrick's hand had released hers, and gone back to the harness he'd been repairing, and she'd gone back to the fire, and they'd sat in their respective silences for the rest of the evening, exactly as they had every other evening. And if anything had changed, it was only in the quality of the air between them, which was slightly less like two strangers sharing a space by accident, and slightly more like two people who had acknowledged, without ceremony, that they were going to keep sharing it on purpose. She did not sleep easily that night. It wasn't fear. She'd moved past the fear of Garrick Voss somewhere around the second week, when she'd understood that a man who wanted to harm her had 6 weeks of opportunity and hadn't taken any of them. It was something more complicated, a kind of accountability settling onto her shoulders that she hadn't felt in a very long time. Since Ohio, maybe. Since before her father's westward obsession had swallowed everything else. She had agreed to something. She had made a decision for her own life, from her own position, with her own voice, and nobody had approved it and nobody had needed to. That was both more frightening and more solid than anything she'd felt in years. She started testing the ankle harder the next morning. Not reckless, she wasn't stupid about it, and she'd watched enough of Garrick's functional pragmatism to have absorbed some of it, but deliberate. She put weight on it in careful increments, noting where the pain was and what kind it was, distinguishing between the sharp protective pain of something that needed rest and the dull grinding pain of something that needed to be worked through. The honest answer was that there was some of both. The bone had knit, but it had knit wrong. In places she could feel the slight wrongness when she walked. A catch in the middle of her stride that her body was already learning to compensate for by shifting her weight fractionally to the outside of the foot. She didn't know if that compensation would hold for the rest of her life, or if it would create new problems in her knee and hip down the road. She filed the uncertainty and kept moving. Garrick noticed. He always noticed she was beginning to understand that the silence was not inattention, but its opposite, a quality of observation so habitual it had become invisible. He said nothing for 2 days, and then on the third day he left a length of smooth birch wood leaning against the door to the cabin, not the door she used to go outside, but the interior door between the main room and the small cold storage, the door she passed a dozen times a day. The wood was the right height for a proper crutch, and had been shaped at the top with something, a knife, she assumed, so it wouldn't dig into her armpit. She picked it up and turned it in her hands and looked at the careful shaping and didn't say anything either. But she switched from the broom that same day and didn't look back. The crutch was better in every practical way. She could move faster, carry things in her free hand, and the contact point under her arm meant she could put even less weight on the ankle when she needed to, which paradoxically let her push it more on the days when she was specifically trying to build the surrounding muscle back up. She developed a rhythm that was not pretty. She was under no illusions about that. Having caught a glimpse of herself reflected in the ice of the water barrel once, and noting that she looked like someone who'd been put together from mismatched parts, and hadn't fully reconciled them yet, but it was functional. And function was what she'd decided to care about. She made herself learn everything she didn't know. The meat preservation was the first big project. Garrick's existing system worked, but it was a one-person system built around his specific schedule and the exact way he moved through the cabin, and it had the kind of invisible inefficiencies that developed when only one person had ever used it. She spent 4 days quietly analyzing it before she said anything, and then she said, if you shifted the hanging order in the cold storage, you'd get better air circulation, and the back pieces wouldn't dry as fast as the front ones. He had looked at her, then at the cold storage, then back at her. Show me. She showed him. He watched, and then he helped, and they rearranged the cold storage together in the particular silence that had become their working mode, not uncomfortable, just focused. Like two people who'd discovered they could be in the same space without needing to narrate it. When they were done, he stood back and looked at the result and said, "That's better." 2 words. She'd learned to understand what they meant from him. The soap was her own initiative, start to finish. She'd found the components, wood ash, rendered fat, water in what they already had, and she worked out the proportions through 3 failed batches that produced something between a solid and a liquid, and smelled terrible, and 1 partial success. And 1 real success that came out hard and faintly yellow, and smelled like nothing at all, which was good enough. Garrick had picked up the finished bar, and turned it in his hands and said nothing for a moment. And then, how'd you know how to do that? My grandmother. She showed me once. I had to work backwards from half a memory and mostly guessing. 3 bad batches. You counted. Hard not to notice. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. The second one smelled like something died in the woodpile. It was the closest thing to a joke she'd heard from him. She stored it carefully. March came in hard, and then softened suddenly in the second week, one of those false springs the Montana mountain country produced sometimes. A week of warm days that melted the top layer of snow and made the trail visible in patches before the cold came back and locked everything down again for another month. Garrick went out to check the pass on a Thursday and came back saying it would still be weeks. He said it without particular emotion, which she'd come to understand meant it was simply information, not a statement about what he wanted. She thought about what she wanted. The question had gotten complicated. In January, the answer had been clear: survive, regain mobility, figure out the valley. By February, it had shifted slightly: survive, regain mobility, not be a burden. Now it was something she couldn't quite resolve into a single clean sentence. She wanted the life she'd been building in this cabin, or something like it. She wanted the competence she was developing. She wanted, and this was the part she examined carefully, looking for dishonesty, because she was committed to not lying to herself anymore. She wanted the specific arrangement she'd agreed to with the specific man she'd agreed to it with. Not because she was in love with him. She didn't think that was what it was. But because she had never in her 23 years felt as consistently, practically respected as she did in this cabin. And she wasn't sure she could give that up for the theoretical alternative of being respected somewhere else by someone else who didn't exist yet. She was sitting with this thought one afternoon in mid-March, working on a piece of leather that needed oil worked into it to prevent cracking, when Garrick came in from a short trap run, stomped the snow off his boots, and said without preamble, "I need to tell you something about the marriage, before the pass opens." She set down the leather. All right. He sat at the table. He didn't have any work in his hands, which was unusual. He normally needed something to do with his hands when he was talking. His large hands sat flat on the table, and he looked at them for a moment before he looked at her. I'm not an easy man to live with, he said. That's not self-pity. It's a fact. I don't talk much. I go days without wanting to talk at all, and I used to think that was a problem, and now I just think it's how I'm built. I get moods in deep winter that are bad. Not violent, he added, looking at her directly, making sure she understood. But dark. I'll go a week barely speaking, barely eating, just present but not really present. My wife found it hard. I'm not your wife yet, Elowen said. And I'm not your first wife. I don't expect you to be the same person for both. Something moved across his face. That's a sensible thing to say. I'm a sensible person. She looked at him steadily. Is there anything else? I don't always know when I've said something wrong. Or when I haven't said something I should have. Elspeth, my wife, she'd go quiet on me, for days sometimes, and I wouldn't know why until I worked backward through the week and figured out what I'd missed. He picked up one thumb and pressed it against the other. I'm not saying I'm going to be better at that. I'll tell you, Elowen said. Directly. If you do something that bothers me, I'll say so. He looked at her, like this was either the best or the most alarming thing anyone had ever said to him, and she couldn't tell which. And I need you to do the same, she added. If I do something wrong, don't go cold on me. Say it. I don't go cold, he said, a shade defensive. You absolutely go cold. You did it last week when I rearranged the trap tools without asking, and you didn't say anything for 2 days. He opened his mouth, closed it. The corner of his jaw shifted in that way it did when he was deciding whether to argue or concede. That was different. It really wasn't. A pause. A longer pause than usual. All right, he said. I'll say it. Good. She picked up the leather again. Is there anything else you wanted to tell me? He was quiet for a moment. Then the pass will open in about 3 weeks. I'd want to go to the valley and make it legal, if that's still what you want. Before we're living as married people. She understood what he meant. He was giving her time. He was giving her the option, even now, of the valley and the settlement and whatever came after. He wasn't assuming anything about what she'd decided. It's still what I want, she said. The marriage. And the mountain. He nodded. He got up, went to the supply shelves, came back with something small and set it on the table in front of her. A ring not elaborate, hammered from what she thought was silver, rough but even, sized for a woman's finger. It was Elspeth's, he said. You don't have to wear it if you'd rather not. I can get something made in the valley. She picked it up. It was cold from the shelf and heavier than she'd expected. She turned it in her fingers, looking at the hammer marks in the metal, the slight imperfection in the band where it had been joined. Something made by hand, by someone who'd tried. I'll wear it, she said. He nodded once and went to hang up his coat. The pass opened on the 2nd day of April. Elowen was standing outside the cabin, something she'd been doing more of in the last 2 weeks, pushing herself to cross the uneven ground around the cabin perimeter on the crutch, building the kind of balance she'd need when Garrick came back from checking the upper trail and said, "We can go in 4 days." 4 days to pack what was necessary and leave what wasn't. She had almost nothing to pack. The clothes she'd been wearing since January, now clean because she'd laundered them 3 times. The broom crutch she'd replaced with the birch one. A few small things that had accumulated a piece of folded leather she'd been using as a practice surface for stitching, a small tin of pine pitch she'd mixed herself for weatherproofing. Garrick packed more efficiently than anyone she'd ever seen. He didn't agonize over decisions, didn't revisit things he'd packed. He moved through the cabin once, hands moving with the decisive certainty of someone who'd done this before and knew exactly what mattered. And in 2 hours he was done. The morning they left, she stood at the door and looked back at the cabin. Low ceiling, smoke-dark logs, the hearth she'd learned to read like a language. The shelf with the tin goods rearranged to her logic. The cold storage with the new hanging order. The faint yellow rectangle on the work table where she'd spilled the first soap batch. Ready? Garrick said from behind her. She turned away from the door. Yes, the trail down was brutal. Brutal not because it was dangerous, the pass was open, the snow was softening. They were moving in good conditions, but because the terrain she was navigating with a crutch and a compromised ankle was the same terrain she'd been carried across in a snowstorm 4 months ago. And every section of it was both unfamiliar and somehow deeply familiar, the way a dream location feels when you encounter it in waking life. She kept her eyes on her footing. She didn't ask for help. Garrick walked at her pace without comment. He didn't pull ahead. He didn't hover. He simply adjusted his stride to hers, the way someone adjusts to the rhythm of a road they're walking for the first time. And they made the descent at a pace that was neither fast nor slow but was sustainable, which was all that mattered. They spent one night on the trail at a natural shelter he knew, a rock overhang with a good windbreak and a patch of ground someone had used for camping before old fire ash, a couple of rusted spikes driven into the rock. He built the fire. She cooked what they'd brought. They ate in the companionable silence that had become their natural register. And when she asked about the nearest settlement, he told her about a town called Granger Creek, a general store, a smith, a small boarding house, a woman named Della Marsh, who'd been performing marriages for 6 years because the valley had no preacher and someone had to do it. Is she official? Elowen asked. Official enough. He looked at the fire. She keeps records, files them when the territorial office sends someone through. Hasn't been challenged yet. That's reassuring, Elowen said. And the way she said it made something shift in his expression, that almost amusement again, there and gone. Granger Creek was a collection of buildings that looked like they'd been dropped from a height and had landed more or less where they'd intended to go, but not quite. The main road, it was generous to call it that. But the intention was clear, ran through the center, with the general store on one side and the smith on the other, and a collection of other structures at angles that suggested they'd been built when the primary concern was function, and the secondary concern was proximity to other buildings, and the concern of forming a coherent town had come later, if at all. Della Marsh was a broad woman of about 50 who looked at Elowen and Garrick standing on her porch with the practiced assessment of someone who'd married a lot of frontier people and had a reasonable sense of which arrangements were going to last. Voss, she said to Garrick, with the familiarity of someone who'd seen him pass through before. Della. He gestured toward Elowen. This is Elowen Harrow. We need a marriage. Della's gaze moved to Elowen, taking in the crutch, the limp, the ring on her finger that Garrick had given her at the cabin and she'd been wearing since. Is this your idea or his? She asked Elowen directly. Mine, Elowen said. We agreed together. Della seemed to find this satisfactory. Come inside then. I'll need 2 witnesses. I'll get the Beaumont boy and Mrs. Finch, they're usually around. The ceremony was shorter than Elowen had expected and more real than she'd feared. Della read from a paper she'd clearly written herself, practical language about partnership and mutual obligation and responsibility. There was nothing soft about it. There was nothing false. When she got to the part about promises, she looked at both of them and said, Don't promise what you can't keep. Better to promise less and mean it. Elowen looked at Garrick. He was looking at her. I will not leave her behind, he said. It was not in Della's script. He said it anyway, flat and certain and entirely without performance. Whatever happens, I won't leave her behind. Her throat did the thing it had done in January, that unprepared tightening. She turned back to Della and said her own part of the words, and meant every syllable. The Beaumont boy, who was about 40, which said something about when Della had started calling people that signed the paper, and a wiry woman named Mrs. Finch signed it, and Della signed it, and it was done. They stayed in Granger Creek for 2 days. Garrick had trading business trap goods to sell, supplies to buy for the next season, and Elowen used the time differently. She walked the settlement, slowly with the crutch, covering every section of the main cluster of buildings, paying attention to everything. Who was there, what they did, what the settlement needed that it didn't have. She went into the general store and had a long conversation with the owner, a thin man named Abernathy, about what goods he moved most and what he was always short on, and what people came in asking for that he never had. She was building a picture. She didn't know exactly what she'd do with it yet, but she'd learned in the past 4 months that information was always worth collecting. On the second afternoon, she was sitting outside the boarding house when a woman came and sat near her, not next to her, but close enough to be intending conversation. She was younger than Elowen by a couple of years, with the particular look of someone who'd been working hard outdoors for a long time, skin weathered early, hands rough, but sharp brown eyes that moved quick. You're Voss's wife, the woman said. Not hostile, just placing her. Elowen Voss, she agreed. The name still felt strange in her mouth, not wrong. Just new, like a coat that fit but hadn't been worn in enough. Marin Tolliver. The woman glanced at the crutch. Mountain wagon accident, Elowen said, coming west last year. Marin was quiet for a moment. You staying up there with him? On the trap line? Yes. Most women won't. Marin said it without judgment. Too isolated, too hard, I know. Elowen looked out at the main road, at two men loading sacks onto a horse. But I've found that isolation and hard are manageable if you're isolated with the right person. Marin looked at her sidelong, and he's the right person. He's honest, Elowen said, and he doesn't make promises he can't keep. She paused. That's rarer than it should be. Something moved across Marin's face, recognition maybe, of a specific kind. Yeah, she said. It really is. They sat together a while longer, not talking much, which was its own kind of companionship. When Garrick came to find her an hour later, Marin looked at him and then at Elowen and said, "Come through in the fall if you make it down." "I'll be here," Elowen said she would. The journey back up the mountain took longer than the journey down, had harder to climb than descend, and Elowen's ankle protested the incline differently than it had protested the descent. A distinct complaint in the tendon along the front of her foot that she had to consciously manage. She stopped twice. She didn't apologize for stopping. Garrick sat on a rock and waited both times, with the same still patience he brought to everything, and when she was ready, they went on. The cabin looked the same. Of course it did, it had only been 2 days. But she'd been half afraid, she realized, that it would look different now, that the terms of her being here had changed. That it would feel smaller, or stranger, or like something she'd claimed too quickly. It didn't. It looked like where she lived. That night, in the firelight, with the mountain quiet outside, and the cold of the high altitude settling back around the walls, Garrick sat at the table, and she sat near the fire, and he said, without looking up from the length of wire he was working, "You spoke with the Tolliver woman this afternoon for a long time." "She's sharp," Elowen said, "and she knows the valley. I want to know who the people are in the places we trade." "Why?" She looked at the fire for a moment. "Because we can't stay up here all the time, every year forever. You have trading relationships with the settlement. I want to understand those relationships and who they depend on. What they need. What we can provide that they don't have a source for." She paused. The soap, for instance. Abernathy said he hasn't had a consistent supply of hard soap in 8 months. He takes in what people bring through, and it's never enough. A beat of silence. "You're thinking about making more." "I'm thinking about what we could build here that isn't just survival. We're already surviving." She looked at him. "We could do more than that." He set down the wire, looked at her with those gray eyes that were hard to read but not impossible. "What did you have in mind?" she told him. It wasn't fully formed, she was the first to say so, laying it out in rough pieces the way she'd lay out a problem she didn't yet have the solution to, honest about the gaps. Soap, to start. She'd gotten good at it, and she'd work out the yield per batch and figure out what they could realistically produce in a season. Tanned hides, she'd learned enough about the process to know she wasn't good at it yet, but she was working on it, and quality hides fetched real money in the valley. And there was something else. Something she'd been turning over since she'd walked Granger Creek's cluster of buildings, looking at what existed and what didn't, a simple skill. Most frontier women knew, but no one in that settlement seemed to be practicing commercially. She could teach. Sewing, preservation, basic medical knowledge, the kind of practical household craft that kept a homestead running through a bad winter. Women in isolated settlements needed those skills and often had nobody to learn from. She could come down twice a year, stay a week, teach what she knew. Garrick listened to all of it. "That last part," he said when she finished. "The teaching. I know it would take time away from the cabinets." "That's not what I was going to say." She stopped. Waited. "I was going to say it's a good idea," he said, "and that you should do it." He looked back at the wire. "I can manage the cabin for a week, twice a year." She looked at him. The firelight moved across the scarred planes of his face, and he was looking at his work with that complete, focused attention he brought to everything. And she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that there was something very close to contentment in the set of his shoulders. Not happiness exactly, because she didn't think either of them were quite there yet, and she didn't think they'd be stupid enough to rush it. But something solid, something that was building. Spring arrived properly in May. In the sudden way spring arrived at altitude, 1 week of cold and the next week of everything trying to live at once, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes, water running everywhere, the air carrying a quality of released pressure. Elowen went without the crutch, for the first time, on a Tuesday in the second week of May. She left it, leaning against the cabin wall, walked to the creek and back about 40 yards, with nothing but her own leg, and the compensating roll of her foot that had become her walk, her particular signature, on the ground. It hurt. It was also the best thing she'd done in months. She did it again the next day, and the day after that. The crutch stayed against the wall. She started picking up tasks she hadn't been able to do efficiently with it, hauling water, carrying firewood in both arms, the ungainly work of moving through the cabin's tight spaces without the extra 2 feet of birch pole to navigate. She dropped things. She misjudged distances her recalibrated stride hadn't caught up with. Twice she went down to one knee because the ankle quit on a patch of uneven ground, and both times she got back up without comment and kept going. Garrick, both times, had been within sight. Both times he had not come rushing over. He had watched to make sure she was up, and then looked it away. It was exactly right. She would have been furious at fussing, and he knew it. Summer's first heat brought the animals out, and the insects with them, and a traveling party of 3 men, who came up the trail in June, looking for a trapper willing to guide them to the northern ridges. They were out of a place called Fort Calhoun, or claimed to be, with the imprecision of men who'd been traveling too long, and they arrived at the cabin at midday, while Garrick was out on the east line. Elowen was in the yard splitting firewood, with a hatchet she'd been practicing with for 2 weeks, her limp pronounced because the uneven ground was always harder than flat surfaces. The men pulled up short when they saw her. The first one, heavy-set, red-faced, with a beard that was trying too hard, said, "We're looking for the trapper Voss." "He's on the east line," she said. "Back this afternoon." Red-Face looked at her hatchet, at the wood she'd been splitting, at her limp. He looked at her the way some men looked at her, with a calculation she recognized. Not the kind her father had made, but a different kind, the kind that was assessing how much weight she could be leaned on. "Maybe we could wait inside," he said. "You can wait here," she said, and went back to the wood. He didn't push it. She thought he might men who tried that kind of thing, usually tried harder when the first attempt didn't work, but he stepped back, and the 3 of them sat on the ground in the yard and waited. She kept splitting wood and didn't speak to them again, unless they asked a direct question. When Garrick came around the eastern tree line 4 hours later and saw the 3 men in his yard, he stopped. His hand went to his rifle, not bringing it up, just resting on it, the way someone puts a hand on something they might need. His eyes moved to Elowen. She gave him a very small nod that meant, "I handled it, it's fine." His hand dropped from the rifle. The negotiation with the men took about 20 minutes, conducted at the table while Elowen was in and out of the cabin on her own business. She caught pieces the price they were offering was low. Garrick's counter was reasonable. They haggled without heat. She heard her name once, one of the men asking who she was, and Garrick's voice coming back flat and immediate, "My wife. She runs this place when I'm out. Not she helps, not she stays here. She runs this place." She stood still in the cold storage for a moment after she heard that. Then she went back to her work. The men left the next morning, with a guide arrangement settled for the following month. A deposit paid in coin that went into the tin box she'd established for their accounts. Another small reorganization that Garrick had raised an eyebrow at, and then said nothing about when she showed him the running tally in the back. Of an old ledger she'd found under the tool shelf. They were building something. She could feel it in the structure of their days now. Not just surviving another winter, but actively building. Each month, adding something to what they had. The soap operation was real now, producing consistent output that she'd started packaging and storing for the fall trip to Granger Creek. The hides were getting better, her technique improving through sheer repetition, and Garrick's occasional wordless corrections. He'd take something from her hands and show her the adjustment, without explaining it, and she'd watch and then do it again until it was right. The ledger was filling up with numbers that showed a pattern, what they brought in, what they spent, what they had left, what they needed. She had her first real argument with Garrick in July. It was about the east line. He'd been pushing it further out, adding traps at the new edge of his range, and she'd done the math on the time cost and the return, and it didn't balance. She brought it up at dinner, and he disagreed. And he disagreed with a certainty that she recognized as the certainty of someone who'd been doing something a particular way for long enough, that any challenge to it felt like a challenge to experience itself. She didn't back down. "Show me the numbers from the east line for the last 2 seasons," she said. "I don't keep numbers." "I know. That's part of the problem." She pushed the ledger across the table. "Look at what I've worked out from what you've told me. The east line takes 2 full days to run and produces. I know what it produces. Then look at what we could produce in 2 days closer in, with better yield per trap because we can check them more often." She pointed at the column. "I'm not saying it's wrong to expand range. I'm saying the timing is wrong. Another year when we have a second set of equipment and can split the lines." "You've been here 8 months," he said, not cruel, but blunt. "I know." She looked at him directly. "And I've been paying attention for all 8 months. I'm not telling you that you don't know the mountain. I'm telling you what the numbers say. You can disagree with the numbers if you want, but you should look at them first." The silence between them was a different kind from the usual, not empty but charged, 2 wills pressing against each other. He looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. She waited. She didn't fill the silence with anything, because she'd learned that with Garrick, the silence was often just thinking, and interrupting it was the wrong move. "The spring figures are off," he said. "The east line does better in spring because of the migration pattern." "Show me." He took the pencil from her hand and wrote in the margin 3 lines of numbers. Rough, without her neatness but accurate. She could see immediately that they were accurate. She looked at them, recalculated. He was right about spring. He was still wrong about summer and fall. "Spring I'll give you," she said. "The rest of it still doesn't balance." He put the pencil down. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. "Next season," he said, "we'll split the lines in fall and see what the numbers say." It was not a capitulation, and it was not a victory. It was 2 people working towards something that neither of them had the complete picture of, and each of them bringing a different part of what was needed, and finding a way to put those parts together that was better than either half alone. She went to bed that night thinking, this is what equal actually feels like. Not easy, not smooth, not always comfortable, but real. Summer deepened and then began to turn. The light changed, first subtle, the quality of it shifting from the flat, bright heat of July to something lower and more golden, the shadows going longer in the afternoon earlier than she'd expected at this latitude. The animals changed too, moving differently, feeding harder, and Garrick read these patterns the way she was learning to read the ledger, fluently and without having to consciously translate. He started making decisions about the trap lines that seemed, to her, to be based on information she couldn't see yet, and when she asked him to explain, he did haltingly, in the vocabulary of someone who'd never had to put instinct into words before, but trying, which was what mattered. She was learning the mountain. Not as fast as he knew it, she'd accepted that it would take years, probably, to have the bone-deep knowledge of terrain and weather and animal behavior that he carried without thinking. But she was building toward it, and she was building it in her own way, which was partly the watching and listening she'd always been good at, and partly the ledger and the numbers and the pattern recognition that she'd developed from counting things that most people didn't think were worth counting. One evening in late August, sitting outside the cabin in the last of the day's warmth, with the mountain going from gold to purple around them, and the air starting to carry the first real edge of the coming fall, Garrick said, "You don't write home." She hadn't expected the topic. They didn't usually talk about the past, not her past, not his, just the present and the near future, which was the shape that worked for them. She looked at the mountains. "No," she said. "Do you know where they went? Your family?" "No." She thought about it. "My father had a land claim somewhere in the Western Territories. That's all I know." She paused. "I don't think about them very much anymore." This was true. She'd expected it to be a thing she had to actively manage, the anger, the grief, the particular wound of having been left by the people who were supposed to be the last ones to leave. But it had faded more quickly than she'd expected, partly because she'd been too busy to maintain it, and partly because something strange had happened. The life she was building had become more real than the one she'd been traveling toward when she was abandoned. The family she'd been traveling with had been heading somewhere. She had arrived. "Do you want to find them?" Garrick asked. She thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "Then maybe Dawson someday." "Not my father." He nodded. He didn't press. They sat there until the last light was gone, and the stars were coming out over the peaks, and the cold was returning in the serious way that meant they should go inside. And neither of them moved for another few minutes, because the moment had a quality to it that was worth sitting in. She was learning something else this summer. Something she hadn't named yet, because she wasn't sure she had the right word for it. It lived in small moments, in the particular way Garrick moved through a problem, the way he'd haltingly explained the animal patterns to her, the way he'd looked at the ledger numbers with the concentrated attention of someone who was genuinely trying to see what she saw. It lived in the way he sometimes came inside at midday and found her working and stopped in the doorway and stood there for just a moment with his hand on the frame before he moved on. It lived in the way her body had started to recognize his footstep before she consciously heard it. She didn't call it love yet. She wasn't sure it was, and she'd made herself a promise about honesty. But she thought it might be becoming something. And for the first time in her memory, becoming something didn't scare her at all. The first real test of their marriage didn't come from the mountain. It came from Elowen's own body. September arrived with a cold snap that settled in the high valleys, like something that intended to stay. And with it came a week where Elowen's ankle was worse than it had been since the early spring thaw, grinding, persistent pain that woke her at night and made the morning walk to the creek feel like a negotiation with something that kept changing its terms. She didn't say anything about it for 3 days, which was a mistake she recognized even as she was making it, the old reflex of not showing weakness, of being the woman who didn't complain, of performing capability so consistently that nobody could ever again add her up and find her wanting. On the 4th morning, she came out of the cold storage, carrying a load of hanging meat that was heavier than it should have been, and her ankle rolled on an uneven board at the threshold, and she went down hard on her good knee with a sound that was partly pain and partly the sheer indignity of it, and Garrick was across the room before she'd processed that she was on the floor. He didn't say anything. He put his hands under her arms and brought her upright, with the same careful, non-ceremonial efficiency he'd used to lift her from the snow 14 months ago. And she stood on her good leg and pressed her lips together, and felt the familiar heat behind her eyes that she refused to let become anything more. "I'm fine," she said. "Your ankle's been bad for 4 days," he said. She looked at him. He looked back, steady and completely unapologetic, about having noticed and said nothing until she needed him to say something. "You didn't mention it," she said. "Neither did you." She absorbed this. He was right, and the particular rightness of it was annoying in the way that accurate things sometimes were. She'd told him back in the winter at the table, when they were still working out the terms of what they were to each other, that she would say it directly if something bothered her. She'd been counting on him to do the same. She'd been applying a different standard to herself, which was exactly the kind of inconsistency she'd been trying to scrub out of her own thinking for the better part of a year. "It's not the bone," she said. "I think it's the tendon. On the front. Sit down." He moved the cot closer to the fire before she could argue about the distance. She sat. He crouched and looked at the ankle with his hands first. Not a doctor's hands, but a man's hands that had dealt with enough injuries in remote places to know what to look for, pressing along the tendon line with a thumb until she drew breath through her teeth. He stopped at that point, looked up at her, and said, "There. Yes, you've been overworking it. I know." She looked at the ceiling. "The fall prep, there's more ground to cover before the cold sets in. The fall prep will get done." He stood up. 2 days on the cot. "Garrick, 2 days." He said it without raising his voice or adding weight to it. "Just a fact," he decided. "Then we reassess. The preserving can wait. The firewood's already stacked. The traps I can run alone for 2 days." She wanted to argue. She had several arguments ready about schedule, about efficiencies, the soap batches she'd been planning to start, about the hide she'd been in the middle of treating. She looked at his face and understood that none of the arguments were actually about the work. They were about the old fear, the one that sat at the base of everything: be useful or be expendable. She lay down on the cot. "Thank you," she said, which was harder to say than any of the arguments would have been. He nodded. He brought her a bowl of the previous evening's stew, reheated, and the leather piece she'd been working on so she'd have something to do with her hands, and he went to the door and stopped and said, without turning around, "You don't have to earn your place here every single day. That's not how it works." She looked at his back. "I know that," she said. He opened the door and went out, and she thought, I'm getting closer to actually believing it. The 2 days off the ankle did what he'd predicted by the third morning. The tendon pain had dropped from a constant grind to an occasional complaint, the kind she could work through without damaging anything further. She came back to full activity carefully, which meant more slowly than she wanted to, but more honestly than she would have managed 6 months ago. The fall preparation resumed. The soap batches got started. The hide she'd been treating came out well better than well, actually, with a softness and evenness she hadn't achieved before, and she spent a long moment running her hands over it in a way that was part satisfaction and part the recognition that she'd learned something through repetition that no amount of explanation could have given her. October came in stages. The first stage was beautiful, and she made herself stop and look at it, even though there were always tasks the way the light fell across the slopes in the afternoon, the aspens going yellow along the creek line, the sky at dusk, a color she had no adequate word for, somewhere between blue and violet, and something colder than either. She was not by nature a woman who stopped for beauty. Her nature leaned toward the practical. But Garrick had said once, briefly, that you had to look at it, or the mountain would break you, and she'd thought about that for several days before she decided he was probably right. The second stage of October was harder. The temperatures dropped and the wind picked up, and the quality of the cold changed from something to be managed to something to be respected. And Garrick came home one evening from the far west line with the particular quiet on him that she'd learned to distinguish from his ordinary quiet. It was the quiet of a man who'd seen something troubling and was deciding how to talk about it. She waited. "There's a storm building," he said, "coming from the north. I could feel it in the wind pattern off the ridge." "How long? 2 days, maybe less." He sat at the table. "I need to push the far lines tomorrow, get to the northern traps before the snow hits, or I'll lose a week's catch. But it means I'll be out overnight. Possibly 2 nights if the storm comes early." She looked at him. He was looking at the table, which meant he was thinking through the implications, and had probably already thought through most of them, and was uncertain about her reaction. "I'll be here," she said. "I know." He looked up. "The storehouse lock has been stiff. I've been meaning to fix it. If you need to get in there quickly, I'll fix it before you leave tomorrow," she said. He nodded. He went to his bunk. She stayed by the fire a while longer, making her own inventory. The cabin was in good shape. The firewood stack was solid. She'd spent 2 weeks on it, far more than they'd had last year. The food stores were good. She knew where every tool was and what it was for, and what to do if something went wrong with the fire or the water barrel or the basic fabric of getting through a winter night alone at altitude. She was not afraid of being alone. That realization settled over her with a quietness she appreciated. A year ago, even 6 months ago, the prospect of a night alone in this cabin, on this mountain in the beginning of a serious storm, would have carried a particular quality of dread. Not just practical concern, but the deeper fear of helplessness, of being in a situation she couldn't manage. That fear was gone. She didn't know exactly when it had left, but she could feel the space where it used to live, and what was in that space now was something that felt a great deal like competence. Garrick left before dawn. She heard him in the dark, the specific sounds of him packing, pulling on the heavy winter coat, moving through the cabin with the light-footed quiet he used when he thought she was sleeping. She lay still and let him go, because waking to say something felt like an intrusion on the particular ritual of a man who went alone into serious country and needed to focus on nothing except what was ahead of him. The door closed. She stayed still for another few minutes, listening to the silence, and then she got up. The ankle was manageable. She'd learned its moods, the way you learned. Another person's the difference between the pain that meant slow down, and the pain that meant adjust, and the pain that meant stop completely. And this morning's quality was the middle kind, the adjust kind, which she did without thinking about it anymore. She built up the fire from the banked coals, boiled water, ate, and then she went outside to look at the sky. Garrick had been right about the storm. She could see it in the north, a darkness at the edge of the range that wasn't clouds exactly, but a quality of sky, a compression, the horizon looking heavier than it had. The wind off that direction was cold with something specific in it, something damp and iron-tasting that she'd learned to associate with serious snowfall. She fixed the storehouse lock first. It took longer than she'd expected. The mechanism had rusted partially in the cold and needed to be cleaned and re-greased before it would work properly. And she did this with methodical patience, working the parts until they moved freely. Then she went inside and checked the firewood supply, the water barrel, the food stores. She moved through the cabin with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been running it for more than a year, touching each thing in her mind's inventory and marking it. Sufficient, sufficient, check tomorrow, sufficient. By midday, the wind had picked up substantially, and the sky in the north had moved from ominous to definitive. She was inside, working on the last of the soap batch. She'd been running a final batch before the hard cold set in, because the fat would congeal in the wrong way below a certain temperature when she heard the sound. She stopped. The soap paddle hung motionless over the pot. The sound came again. It was not the wind. She knew the wind's vocabulary now, its variations and rhythms, the way it worked against the cabin walls, the specific sound it made through the gap at the northeast corner that she'd patched twice, and that kept opening up. This was something outside the cabin, and not the wind, and not a branch, and not the creek. She moved to the window. It was a single oiled paper pane that let in light but not a clear view, and she put her face close to it and tried to see through the amber translucence. A shape. Dark. Moving. She went to the door and picked up the hatchet from beside it before she opened it, because she'd learned that from Garrick, you don't open a door at altitude in fall without knowing what might be on the other side. She opened the door. The mountain lion was at the storehouse. Not small, full-grown female, Elowen thought, though she'd only seen one before at distance, this one close enough that she could see the amber color of its coat and the specific way its shoulders were set as it worked at the storehouse door. Working at it, trying to get in, drawn by the smell of stored meat, and the lock she'd repaired this morning was holding it out, but only just. The wood of the doorframe was already showing damage, parallel gouges where the animal had tried. The lion stopped, turned its head, looked directly at Elowen standing in the cabin doorway. She was about 12 feet away. Her heart was doing something extremely loud and unhelpful in her chest, and her hands were tight on the hatchet handle. And some part of her brain was being very clear and practical about the fact that a hatchet at 12 feet against a mountain lion was not a favorable equation. Her ankle had registered the moment immediately, the familiar flare of protest at the sudden alertness in her stance, and she noted this the way you noted a price you were going to have to pay. The lion held the look for a long moment. Then it went back to the storehouse door. Elowen did not move. She calculated not calmly. Her heart was not calm, but her mind was doing the things she'd trained it to do, moving through facts faster than feeling. The storehouse had everything. Every preserved piece of meat they had for the winter. Every batch of lard and every salted store. They could not lose the storehouse. Losing the storehouse was not an option she was willing to accept. Garrick's rifle was inside the cabin. She had seen him take it, the large one, the one he always carried on the far lines. But leaning against the wall beside his bunk, on its wooden pegs, was the smaller rifle, the one he kept as a backup, the one he'd taken down twice to check the mechanism and put back without explanation. She had never fired it. She had never fired any rifle. But she'd watched him. She'd always been watching him. And she knew the mechanism. She'd held it once when he was cleaning it, and she'd asked how the loading worked, and he'd shown her. And the rifle was loaded now because he kept it loaded. She took one step back into the cabin, then two. She didn't run running triggers pursuit. She knew that with a certainty she couldn't have explained. She moved backward with steady deliberateness, keeping her face toward the lion, and reached the wall and took the rifle down from its pegs. It was heavier than she'd expected from holding it briefly before. Heavier and longer, and her hands weren't his hands, and the balance felt unfamiliar and wrong, in a way she'd need to compensate for. She moved back to the door. Her ankle was yelling at her now. The alertness of her stance had put weight on it in a way that wasn't good, and she shifted to her good leg and brought the rifle up. The lion was still at the storehouse, still working at the door. She had probably one shot. She'd be a fool to believe otherwise. She'd never fired a rifle. The light was bad, the distance was manageable but not easy, and the animal would not hold still for a second attempt. She needed to place it right the first time. She brought the rifle up to her shoulder. It was too long a game for her for frame. The butt too far back, the barrel too far forward, and she couldn't get a proper sight picture. She adjusted, brought it out from her shoulder slightly, changed her stance, found a grip that felt less wrong than the first. Her arms were shaking, not dramatically, but enough to matter. She breathed, focused on her breathing the way she focused on everything with the deliberate, grinding patience of someone who had learned that the difference between a good outcome and a disaster was usually whether you'd been willing to take one more careful second before acting. The lion turned toward her. It had registered the rifle, or registered her stillness, or something. The animal's attention had shifted, and it was looking at the cabin doorway again. And its shoulders were doing something that Elowen recognized even without prior experience, as the particular lowering that meant the animal was deciding about something. She fired. The sound was extraordinary in the mountain, quiet, a crack that went in every direction at once and bounced off the slope behind the cabin and came back, layered on itself. The recoil hit her shoulder hard and snapped her back a half step, and she went down on her bad ankle, and the pain that went through it was so sharp and immediate that her vision went white at the edges for a moment. She got her vision back. The lion was gone. Not dead, she understood that immediately, scanning the yard with the rifle still up, her shoulder throbbing, and her ankle screaming and her heart still very loud. The animal had run. Whether she'd hit it or whether the sound alone had been enough, she couldn't tell, and she wasn't going to move out of the doorway to check. She stood there for a full minute, maybe two, watching the tree line, watching the shadow of the storehouse, watching everything. Nothing came back. She lowered the rifle. Her ankle gave out about 30 seconds later, and she sat down on the cabin floor in the doorway, right there on the threshold with the cold coming in and the smell of gunpowder in the air, and she shook. Full body shaking, the delayed physical response to the sustained tension, her hands losing their grip on the rifle, and her jaw clenching against the chattering of her teeth. She sat through it, because she'd learned that trying to suppress this kind of reaction extended it better to let the body do what it needed to do, and then be done. After a while, the shaking stopped. She got up, examined the storehouse door the lock had held, but the wood of the frame was damaged enough that she'd need to reinforce it. She went inside and got the hammer and the spare boards she knew were under the work shelf, and she went back out and reinforced the storehouse frame, working in the rising wind, her ankle braced against the uneven ground by a determined act of will. When she was done, the door would hold against anything short of a determined bear. She went inside. She reloaded the rifle slowly, with the manual concentration of someone doing a thing for the second time when the first time had been improvised under extreme pressure. She got it right. She checked it. She put it back on its pegs, and then she took it back down and propped it against the wall beside the door, because a weapon on pegs was for a normal day, and today was not a normal day. Then she sat in the chair by the fire and opened the ledger, because the work still needed to be done, and sitting with fear was not something she had any patience for, and she stayed there working until the storm hit properly at nightfall. The storm was serious. She'd seen storms in the 8 months she'd been at altitude, had developed a working vocabulary for them, minor, moderate, significant, but this one was something she didn't have a category for yet. It came at nightfall, and it hit the cabin like it meant something personal. The wind slamming against the walls with a rhythmic ferocity that made the logs creak, and the fire flatten in the hearth even though the damper was closed, and there should have been no draft. She spent 3 hours managing the fire in the way Garrick had showed her, keeping it hot enough to matter without burning through wood at a rate the supply couldn't sustain. And she did this with the automatic competence of someone who'd done it enough times that it no longer required conscious thought. She did not sleep. She kept watch. Partly because of the lion, she wasn't convinced it wouldn't come back. And the storehouse door, while reinforced, was still showing damage, and partly because the storm was extreme enough that she wanted to know if anything in the cabin's structure started giving way. She moved through the night in the way she'd learned to move through difficult things. One task at a time, 1 hour at a time. Not projecting forward into what might go wrong, but dealing with what was actually in front of her. The fire, the walls, the water barrel, the storehouse, checked through the window whenever the wind dropped enough to see outside. By 3 a.m, the wind had changed character from the violent assault of the first hours to a sustained grinding pressure that was in some ways harder because it didn't let up and didn't give the structure any rest. She found the northeast corner opening again, the one she'd patched twice, and spent 40 minutes in the dark with cold fingers working pine pitch into the gap until it stopped. By dawn, the wind had dropped to something manageable, and the snow was coming down in the steady, serious way that meant it was going to continue for a while, but wasn't going to kill anything. She made herself eat. She checked the storehouse. The reinforced door was solid. No signs of the lion returning, which didn't mean it wasn't going to, but at least meant it hadn't in the night. She counted the firewood supply and recalculated against an extended storm scenario, and found they had margin, which was one of the few things that morning that was fully in her favor. She was splitting wood in the early afternoon, not because she needed more, but because she needed the physical work, the specific exhaustion of it that quieted everything else, when she heard footsteps. Her head came up. The footsteps were familiar. The weight and rhythm of them, the particular way they broke through the crust of snow without trying to be quiet. She turned around. Garrick came around the east side of the cabin with his rifle across his back and his coat heavy with snow, and an expression that moved so quickly when he saw her standing in the yard that she almost missed it. Relief. Immediate and complete, gone in a half-second but real. "You're back early," she said. "Storm came faster than I expected." He stopped and looked at the storehouse. Looked at the new boards on the doorframe, the hammer marks still raw in the wood. Looked at her. What happened? Mountain lion at the storehouse. She set the hatchet down. Last afternoon, before the storm. His eyes had gone to the rifle propped beside the cabin door. She'd brought it out when she started working. Old habit already. Know where your tools are and then back to her face, reading the sequence of events. "You fired once." She ran. She paused. "I'm not sure I hit her." "Did you check?" "I checked the door. I didn't go to the tree line." He nodded. This was the right answer, and he knew it. Going to the tree line to check whether a wounded mountain lion had stayed nearby was not smart unless you had no choice. "I'll go look." "After you eat," she said. "You've been out for 36 hours. He looked at her for a moment. Then he went inside. She followed. He ate quickly, standing at the table the way he did when he was tired, and didn't want to make the full commitment of sitting down. She put the food in front of him without commentary and stood near the fire, working feeling back into her fingers. When he was done, he said, "Show me what you used." She took the backup rifle from where she'd propped it and handed it to him. He looked at it, checked the load she'd put in, checked the mechanism, ran his thumb along the barrel. "You reloaded it?" "Yes." He looked at the barrel again. Then he looked at her, a long look, the kind he used when he was working something out. "How was the recoil?" She touched her shoulder. "I went back a step. Hit my ankle." He put the rifle down, came to her and put his hand on her shoulder, just pressed it, once, feeling the bone and joint. She didn't move. He'd done this before when she'd been injured, this quick, practical assessment that was not tenderness and was not detachment either, just care expressed in the only register he was comfortable with. "Nothing's broken," he said. "I know. You're going to be sore for a week." "I know that too." He took his hand back. He looked at the rifle. Then he looked at her and said something she hadn't expected, delivered in his flat, undecorated way. "When I was coming down the East Ridge this morning, before I knew what happened here, I was worried about you. Not because I thought you couldn't handle things." He stopped, chose the next words carefully. "Just because I wanted you to be all right. The way you want something you—" He stopped again. She waited. "The way you want something that matters," he said. The fire moved behind her. Outside, the snow was still coming down, steady and quiet. "I'm all right," she said. "I can see that." The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but something close to one, something that reached his eyes this time, which was new. "I left one person here and came back to someone who'd reinforced a door and fired a rifle for the first time, and kept the fire through a serious storm. The northeast corner opened up again, she said. I patched it at 3 in the morning. He looked at the corner, looked at the fresh pine pitch at the gap, shook his head slowly, not in frustration, in something that had more warmth in it than she'd seen before. I'll fix that properly in the spring, he said. I've been patching it for 4 years. I know, she said. I've been watching you patch it. They went to check the tree line together, because he wouldn't go alone and she wouldn't let him, and they found blood at the base of a spruce 30 yards from the cabin. A single heavy splash, and then a trail going north that petered out after 60 feet. She'd hit the animal. Not lethally, the lion had run too far, and the trail showed no further drops but hit it, which meant she'd had a good placement on a difficult shot with an unfamiliar weapon at genuine stress. That's a decent shot, Garrick said, crouching at the blood in the snow. The recoil knocked me down. The shot was still decent. He looked up. She won't come back. Not soon. They went back to the cabin. The storm continued through the afternoon and into another night, but it was a different thing with both of them inside the wind, still working at the walls. The fire needing management, the same tasks as the night before, but shared, which changed the weight of everything. He took the night watch, and she slept properly for the first time in 36 hours, deep and without dreams, and woke to a morning where the storm had broken and the mountain was white and still and very bright. Garrick was sitting at the table. On the table beside him, laid flat, was a smaller rifle, a short-stock model, that she could see immediately was sized differently from either of the two she'd handled. He'd taken it apart and cleaned it and was putting it back together with the automatic ease of long practice. Whose is that? She asked. Yours, he said. I've had it in the pack store. He looked up. It's lighter, stock's shorter. You'll be able to get a cleaner sight picture. He looked back at the mechanism. I should have given it to you sooner. She looked at the rifle. At him. Why didn't you? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. I told myself it was because you were still learning. That it was too soon. He put the firing mechanisms back into the stock. But honestly, he stopped. This was his tell not the silence, but the hesitation before honesty, the beat where he decided whether to say the real thing. I think I hadn't fully shifted in my thinking. About you, what do you mean? He looked at her directly. When I brought you here, you were injured and alone. I thought of you as someone I needed to be responsible for. Even after you started proving that was wrong, part of my thinking was still in that place. He set the rifle down. Yesterday changed that. She thought about what that meant. You're saying you didn't think of me as someone who could protect herself. I'm saying I knew it in my head, he said. I'm saying it took watching you do it before I knew it in the part of me that counts. She sat down at the table, picked up the rifle and turned it in her hands. The balance was immediately better. It was still heavy. She'd need to build up the specific arm strength to use it properly, but the length was right for her reach, and she could already feel that the sight picture would be more natural. Show me how to handle it properly, she said. Not just the basic mechanism. All of it. Starting today? Starting now. He picked up his own rifle from the wall. Come outside, then. They spent 2 hours in the cold white aftermath of the storm, in the yard with the still knee-deep in the shade and the light ricocheting painfully off every surface, and he showed her. Not patient in the way a teacher is patient, built for that. And she didn't want performance, but patient in the way a good partner is patient, which is that he showed her a thing, and then waited while she worked it out, and corrected when she went wrong, and didn't make anything of the corrections. She was a poor shot at first. She accepted this as information and not judgment. She learned the way she learned everything through repetition and the precise analysis of what went wrong each time, the gradual calibration of her own hands and eye, and the specific language of this particular tool. By the end of the second hour, she was placing shots consistently enough that Garrick said, "Your instinct is already there. You're just not trusting it yet. How do I fix that?" Do it enough times that you don't have to think about it. He picked up the last of the improvised targets. She'd been using a scrap of bark propped in the snow. Same way you fixed the ankle. Same way you learned the preservation. You do it until you don't need to decide to do it anymore. She looked at him. At this man she'd married for practical reasons that had, without either of them quite agreeing to it, become something more complicated and more real. The light was still brutal off the snow, and it hit his face at a hard angle that showed every scar, every line, every piece of damage that living in this country had done to him over 39 years. He looked back at her. "When we go to Granger Creek in the fall," she said, "I want to go properly. Both of us together. Not just for the trading." "You want to be seen," he said. "Not a judgment, just understanding. I want people to see us." She looked at the mountains. "What we actually are." "And what are we?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she did everything. She thought about the ledger and the soap and the argument about the East Line and the moment this morning at the table and the way she'd felt, shaking on the cabin floor with the rifle in her hands and the lion gone. That she had done something from her own center, her own self, and that it had been enough. "Partners," she said, "real ones." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said yes. They went back inside. She made food and he split wood, and the day moved through its ordinary rhythms. And the mountain outside was white and quiet and enormous, and neither of them said anything more about it, because they didn't need to. The thing had been named. It was sitting between them now, solid and without decoration, the way all the real things in this cabin were. The fall trip to Granger Creek happened in the third week of October, when the weather gave them a window, a clear run of cold days without storm threat, long enough to make the descent, do business, and return before the next system came through. They went with a full pack, the soap she'd spent the summer producing, a collection of quality hides, 2 pieces of preserved meat for trading, and the ledger with its season's accounting. Elowen walked into Granger Creek on her own feet with her own rifle on her back. The limp was visible. It was always going to be visible. She had stopped, somewhere in the summer, moving through spaces in the particular way she'd developed early on, the way of trying to minimize the irregularity of her gait, making herself smaller in her movement so people might not notice. She didn't know exactly when she'd stopped doing it. She just knew that she walked the way she walked now, and it was her walk, and it covered ground. Marin Tolliver was at the general store when they came in. She looked at Elowen, and then at the rifle, and then at Garrick, and then back at Elowen. And what moved across her face was a complex thing that might have been surprise, and might have been recognition, and might have been something adjacent to respect. "You made it through," she said. "All the way through," Elowen said. Abernathy, the store owner, was behind the counter. He looked at the pack Garrick was setting down. He looked at the soap when Elowen started laying it out 30 bars, more than she'd promised him in April, and better quality. He picked one up and turned it in his hands and said, "This is real." "It's real," she agreed. "We can do this quantity twice a year. Maybe more in good seasons." He looked at the hides. He was quiet for a moment with the practiced quiet of a man doing arithmetic. "I'll take everything you've got, and I'll pay the rate I quoted before, plus 10% if you can hold to the schedule." She had her own arithmetic ready. She'd been running it for 2 weeks. 15%, she said, "and we talk about what else you're short on." Garrick, standing behind her left shoulder, said nothing at all. Abernathy looked at her for a moment. Then he said 15. "And we talk." She put out her hand. He shook it. They met with 4 other people in the 2 days they were in Granger Creek, a woman who wanted to know about the soap-making process, 2 men who needed a guide for the following season, a family newly arrived who were asking about the upper mountain country with the specific combination of ambition and unpreparedness that she was beginning to recognize as a type. She talked to all of them. She handled 2 of the conversations completely on her own, while Garrick was at the smith, having a trap mechanism repaired, and she didn't look for him when something got complicated. She worked it out herself. On the evening of the second day, sitting with Marin at the edge of the boarding house porch in the cold, Marin said, "You're different from April." "I know. Not different bad." Marin looked at the mountains. "Just more settled. In yourself." Elowen thought about how to say what she actually meant, as opposed to what would sound right. She'd gotten careful about that distinction. "In April I knew what I was capable of," she said. "By now I've actually done most of it." Marin smiled, a real one, not polite. "There's a woman in the east part of the settlement. Agnes Brewster. She's been asking everyone who passes through if they know anyone who could teach basic preservation and sewing. She's got 6 families in that section, and none of them have the skills to get through a bad winter properly." Elowen looked at her. I could do that, she said. When we come through in spring. I thought you might say that. Marin looked back at the mountains. I'll tell her to expect you. They started back the next morning, early, with the pack lighter, and the ledger's numbers better than they'd started, and the mountain above them going white and steep in the morning light. Garrick set the pace longer than she usually pushed, a sign he wanted to cover ground before the weather shifted, and she matched it without complaint. Her limp pronounced on the uphill in the specific way it always was, and it didn't slow them. Halfway up on a switchback where the trail widened enough to walk two abreast, he said, "The Brewster woman. Marin told me about her. I know, I was at the Smith." He glanced sideways at her. 6 families is a lot to teach in one visit. I'll stay a week. Maybe 10 days. She met his eyes. You said you could manage. I can manage. A pause. I was going to say you should take some of the soap stock with you. For the teaching. Not to sell to use as demonstration material. She looked at him. He was already looking back at the trail, which was his way say the thing, and move on. Don't stand in the moment of it. That's a good idea, she said. They climbed. The cabin, when they reached it in the last of the afternoon light, looked like it always looked low and rough and exactly adequate, smoke dark, and built for function. She'd stopped seeing it with a stranger's eyes many months ago. It was just home, and that was that. Garrick unlocked the storehouse, the repaired lock, which she'd fixed 2 months ago, and which had been working properly ever since, and they stowed the trading goods that were coming back with them. He moved efficiently in the small space, and she moved around him in the way she'd learned, each of them knowing the other's spatial habits well enough to share a small room without constant collision. When they were done, they stood in the doorway of the storehouse for a moment, looking at the organized interior of the soap stock, the hides waiting for next season, the preserved food lined up in the order she'd established. Good season, Garrick said. First of many, she said. He looked at her then. The light was low and the cold was coming on fast, and his face was the complicated, scarred, readable thing it had slowly become to her over the past year. She looked back at him. Whatever it was that had been becoming something it was done becoming. She knew what it was now. She thought he did too, and she thought they'd probably say it soon, probably in the ordinary way they said all the real things, without preparation or ceremony. In the middle of some other task, in the way of 2 people who'd learned that the moment was less important than the truth in it. But not tonight. Tonight there was supper to make and wood to bank, and a mountain winter settling in around them with its full weight, demanding everything they had, taking nothing for granted. She went inside and built up the fire. He came in behind her and closed the door against the cold. The mountain did what the mountain always did. They stayed. They said it in November, not with any preparation. Not with the particular weight that people sometimes assign to those words, building toward them like a ceremony. It happened the way the real things between them always happened sideways, in the middle of something else, without warning. They'd been arguing about the northeast corner again. Garrick had finally gotten around to pulling the interior log back to look at what was happening behind the wall, the real cause of the recurring gap, which turned out to be a settling issue in the foundation timber. Something that had been shifting incrementally for years, and would keep shifting unless addressed properly. He was lying on his back with his upper half inside the wall cavity, talking in the muffled, irritated way of a man who could see a problem clearly and didn't like what he was seeing. And she was holding the lamp and handing him tools when he asked for them, and he said something that she didn't fully catch. "What?" she said. He pulled himself out partway. His face was dusty and his beard had picked up a cobweb, and he looked genuinely annoyed. "I said this is going to take 3 days to fix properly, and we'll need to pull half the interior wall to do it." "Then we pull half the wall," she said. He looked at her for a moment, the lamp between them, his face half in shadow. "You're not even a little bothered by that. It's a wall. It can be put back." He looked at her for another moment. Something moved in his face that she'd gotten better at reading. Not the quick movements that were easy to miss, but the slower ones, the ones that came up from somewhere deeper. "I love you," he said, like it was an obvious thing he'd only just gotten around to saying out loud. Like it was another item on the list of things that needed to be addressed. Then he went back into the wall. She stood there with the lamp. "I know," she said after a moment. "Then I love you too." I know, he said from inside the wall. She almost laughed. She held it down to a slow exhale and handed him the next tool he asked for, and the conversation moved back to the foundation timber, and that was that. It didn't change anything. That was the remarkable part. Nothing shifted in the structure of their days. No sudden softness crept in where there had been practical clarity. No performance of feeling replaced the habitual honesty. What it did was settle something, the way a joint settles when you finally put a screw in the right place. Everything that had been there before was still there. It was just held better. The winter came in hard that year. Harder than the previous one, Garrick said. Though she wouldn't have known how to measure it, she had only one prior Montana winter for comparison, and she'd spent the first half of it on a cot, which didn't count as real experience of the thing. What she knew was that this winter had a quality of persistence that the last one hadn't fully had, storm after storm coming through, with barely enough gap between them to work the trap lines properly. The temperatures dropping in the third week of November, to something she felt in the walls of the cabin, even with a good fire going. Garrick's dark moods came with the deep cold. He'd warned her about this in the early spring, before the pass had opened, sitting at the table with his hands flat and his voice even and careful. She'd filed the information the way she filed everything that mattered, not in the front of her mind, where she'd keep checking it anxiously, but in the deeper part where it would be there when she needed it. She needed it in December. It started as a reduction. Less talking, which was hard to notice because there had never been much. Then a reduction in eating, not refusing food, but forgetting it, sitting at the table with a bowl and moving the contents without actually consuming them. Then the thing he'd described present but not present, physically in the cabin and doing the necessary tasks, but somewhere else behind his eyes, in a place she couldn't reach and she'd decided shouldn't try to reach by force. She watched. She kept the days orderly, because that seemed to help the rhythm of meals at consistent times, the work continuing, the fire maintained, no extraordinary demands placed on him. She talked to him at the normal frequency and didn't interpret the shorter answers as anything other than what he'd told her they were. Weather inside, same as weather outside. Nothing personal, and nothing she'd caused, and nothing she could fix. She didn't perform cheerfulness. She was not a cheerful person by nature, and performing it would have been false, in a way he would have seen through immediately, and she'd made herself a promise about falseness. What she did was stay, be there, keep the cabin running with the same competence and the same quiet that had been the register of their life together since before they'd named anything. Sometimes in the evenings she moved her chair slightly closer to his side of the table, not close enough to crowd, just close enough to be unmistakably present. She didn't make anything of it. She just moved the chair. 12 days into the worst of it, he looked up from the untouched bowl and said, "I know what I'm like." "I know you do," she said. "It's not—" He stopped. Tried again. "I'm not somewhere else because I want to be." "I know that too." She looked at him directly. "Eat your food, Garrick. It's not going to help anything to be hungry on top of it." He looked at the bowl. He ate. It was not a cure, but it was something, the small, ordinary insistence of someone who wasn't going to pretend the problem wasn't there and wasn't going to catastrophize it either. She didn't know if she was handling it right. She had no frame of reference for this, no mother to ask, no woman friend within 30 miles, nothing except her own observation and the stubborn belief that what he needed was not rescue but company. By the third week of December, the mood had lifted, somewhat, not gone, but loosened, the way packed snow loosens when the temperature comes up a few degrees, still there but not locked. He came back from the east line one afternoon moving differently, something easier in his shoulders, and he sat at the table and said without preamble, "I'm coming back." "I can see that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't push." "No, most people push." He rubbed his jaw. Elspeth pushed. She thought if she could talk me through it, pull me back by talking. It didn't work, and it made her feel like it was her fault when it didn't. "I'm not most people," Elowen said. "And I'm not Elspeth." She said it without edge. Just clarification. "No," he said. "You're not." She poured 2 cups of the bitter pine bark tea she'd been making all winter, not good, but warming, and it was something to do with her hands. She put one in front of him and kept one for herself, and they sat in the quiet that was their particular fluency, and outside the snow came down in the patient, relentless way it would keep doing for another 3 months at least. January arrived with a cold snap that broke a branch off the big pine at the east corner of the cabin, a branch she'd been watching all fall with the specific concern of someone who had learned to read structural stress in things, and it came down. At 3 a.m, with a sound like a rifle shot, and woke them both. She was on her feet before she was fully awake, reaching for the rifle by the door with the automatic speed of someone who'd been training the response for months, and Garrick was right behind her. And they stood in the cold dark of the cabin for 3 seconds looking at each other before the adrenaline cleared enough to understand what had happened. Then she started laughing. It wasn't entirely funny, her heart was still going too fast, and the branch had hit the corner of the roof, and there was probably damage to check in the morning. But there was something in the two of them standing in the middle of the night, with their weapons ready, both processing the same ridiculous surprise at the same rate, that was genuinely absurd in a way that demanded acknowledgement. After a moment, the corner of his mouth moved. "Branch," he said. "Branch," she confirmed. They went back to sleep. In the morning, checking the roof, she found 2 cracked sections where the branch had hit small enough to patch temporarily until spring, serious enough that it needed attention before the next heavy snow load. She was on the roof with the pine pitch and the tools before Garrick had finished his breakfast, which he discovered when he came outside and looked up and said her name in the specific flat tone that meant he was moderating a stronger reaction. "I was going to do that," he said. "You were finishing your food." "I started already." She didn't look down. The pitch was at the right temperature, and she had maybe 15 minutes before it cooled too much to work properly. "Hand me the wide scraper." A pause. Then the scraper appeared over the edge of the roof. He'd climbed the timber frame without her hearing him, which was impressive and also slightly startling when his hand appeared 6 inches from her face. "You could have waited," he said, from just below roof level. "I could have." She took the scraper. "I didn't want to." He climbed the rest of the way up and looked at what she'd done the first section patched, the second one cleaned and ready. He looked at her hands, at the careful application, at the joints she'd sealed. He picked up the horn of pitch she'd brought up and started working on the second section without another word. They fixed the roof together, passing tools back and forth with the wordless efficiency of people who knew each other's hands. And Elowen thought not for the first time how strange and specific this kind of closeness was. Not the closeness of poetry or of the soft domestic arrangements she'd watched in Ohio, the particular performance of love that was mostly about looking at each other. This was something done side by side, looking at the same problem, working toward the same end, each one being more capable with the other there. She thought she'd never wanted anything she'd expected less. February brought Maren Tolliver. This was a surprise. Maren had said she'd see them in spring, and February was emphatically not spring, and the sight of a single figure coming up the trail on a Thursday afternoon, moving fast enough that something was wrong, brought Elowen to the doorway before the figure was close enough to identify. Garrick was on the near trap line and not back until evening. She picked up the rifle and went out to meet the person on the trail, and when she was close enough to see it was Maren, she lowered the weapon and waited. Maren arrived breathing hard. She'd been moving uphill at a pace that wasn't quite running, but was everything short of it. She stopped, put her hands on her knees for a moment, and then straightened and looked at Elowen with something serious in her face. "The Brewster family," she said, getting her breath. "Agnes's husband fell through ice crossing the creek 2 weeks ago. He's alive, but he can't work and he can't walk properly, and they've got a bad situation with their food stores." She said she wasn't going to ask for help. Maren's jaw tightened. She's been saying that for 2 weeks while her children are going hungry. Elowen was already thinking about the storehouse. "How many children?" 4. "Youngest is maybe 3 years old. How long did it take you to get up here?" 4 hours. I pushed. Elowen looked at the sky, the light, the cloud cover, the quality of the air. "I can't get back to Granger Creek tonight with supplies and make it safe. Tomorrow morning, early." She was already running the inventory of what they could give without compromising their own situation through the remaining 2 months of winter. "Come inside. Eat something. You're staying the night." Maren looked at her. "You're not going to say it's too much? Or ask Garrick first?" "Garrick will agree," Elowen said, "and it's not too much." She turned toward the cabin. "Come inside." It was the first time she'd had someone stay in the cabin besides themselves. She hadn't thought about it until Maren was sitting at the table, the particular strangeness of another person in the space, another set of eyes moving over the arrangement of things, the quiet systems she'd built into the daily running of the place. Maren didn't comment on any of it, which Elowen appreciated, but she noticed her looking, and Elowen could read the assessment happening behind those sharp brown eyes. When Garrick came in at dusk and found a strange woman at his table, his hand went to his knife before he'd fully registered that it was a person he recognized from the settlement, and then his hand came back and he looked at Elowen. She explained about the Brewsters in 4 sentences. He looked at the storehouse, looked at the calendar. He kept a rough one, hash marks on a board that told him how many weeks of stores they'd planned for. Looked at Maren. "You'll take what you need tomorrow and go back." I'll take it down," he said on the sled. Faster than carrying. Maren looked at him for a moment. She'd known him from trading visits, Elowen assumed, in the impersonal way that people in a small settlement know each other without ever having had a real conversation. She seemed to be recalibrating something. "That's thank you, Voss." "The sled's faster," he said again, and sat down and put out his hand for a food bowl, and Maren, to her credit, didn't make anything further of it. They ate together, 3 people, which changed the acoustics of the cabin and the rhythm of the meal in a way that was not bad, just different. Maren told them what was happening in Granger Creek, the winter news, 2 families who'd arrived in October and were struggling, Abernathy expanding the store with a second building, a land dispute at the settlement's south edge that was getting unfriendly. Garrick asked a couple of direct questions about the land dispute. Elowen listened and filed everything, because Maren's news was always specific, and specific things were useful. At one point, Maren said, looking at the rifle on the wall, Elowen's rifle, the short-stock one, on its own set of pegs beside Garrick's, "Is that yours?" "Yes," Elowen said. "You shoot?" "I'm getting better at it." Maren looked at Garrick. "Did you teach her?" "Some," he said. "She picks things up fast." "She picked up the mountain lion story in October," Maren said, with a sideways look at Elowen. "Half of Granger Creek has heard it. Abernathy tells it to anyone who'll listen." Elowen looked at her food. "Abernathy should find better material." "Maybe." Maren's voice had something in it. "Or maybe people who come up here alone from the valley, like hearing that there's someone on this mountain who can handle what comes at her." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Garrick said, "There is," and went back to his bowl. They made the descent the next morning in the dark, early enough that the cold was at its worst, and the trail was frozen to its hardest, better for the sled, which needed firm ground to run properly. Garrick pulled the sled, and Elowen walked beside him, and Maren went ahead because she knew the Brewsters' location and the route from the trail into their section. They were loaded with preserved meat, 2 solid blocks of lard, a full bag of hard soap, dried herbs, and 2 bolts of the flannel Elowen had bought from Abernathy in October and been saving for spring teaching purposes. The Brewsters' place was a single-room structure on the east side of the Granger Creek settlement cluster, set slightly apart in the way of families that hadn't yet integrated fully into whatever social fabric the settlement was building. Agnes Brewster came to the door when Maren knocked, and the look on her face when she saw the sled was the complicated expression of someone who needed help badly and had been telling herself for 2 weeks that she didn't. She was about 40, strongly built, with the specific look of someone who'd been managing hard things for a long time. Behind her, in the dim room, Elowen could see children. She counted 3 visible and heard a 4th somewhere. Her husband was in a chair near a fire that needed more wood than it was getting. "I don't take charity," Agnes said, not moving from the doorway. "It's not charity," Elowen said. "It's what neighbors do." Agnes looked at her. "We don't know each other." "We will," Elowen said. "I'm coming back in spring to teach. You'll be one of the first I talk to." She held the woman's eyes. "Take the supplies, Agnes. For your children, if not for yourself." A long pause. Agnes looked at the sled, at the children who had come to the doorway around her legs. She stepped back and let them in. They spent 3 hours at the Brewsters. Garrick fixed the fire structure. It had been built wrong, losing most of its heat up the flue, and brought in more wood from the outside stack, which Agnes hadn't been able to reach easily with her husband, unable to help. Maren organized the food stores. Elowen sat with Agnes at the table, and looked at their actual situation, what they had, what they needed to get through to spring, what was manageable and what wasn't, and talked through it plainly, without softening it and without catastrophizing. "The soap," Agnes said at one point, turning one of the bars in her hands. "Abernathy said you made this." "Yes." "How?" Elowen showed her. Not the full process, they didn't have the materials for it right now, but the logic of it, the components, what she'd need to set up her own production when spring came and materials were accessible. Agnes listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that information was the most permanent kind of resource. When they were leaving, Agnes walked them to the sled and stood in the cold without her coat, which said something about how much she didn't want the moment to feel like a dismissal. She looked at Elowen, and then at Garrick, and then back at Elowen. "He doesn't say much," she said quietly, nodding toward Garrick, who was checking the sled ties. "No," Elowen agreed, "but you came down the mountain in the dark." "In February, yes." Agnes looked at the ground for a moment. "My husband would have done that once." She said it without self-pity, just honesty. "Before he got afraid of things." Elowen thought about saying something and decided that what Agnes had said didn't need a response. She put her hand briefly on the woman's arm, a light contact, and then she went to the sled. On the way back up, Garrick said, "She'll be all right." "She's capable," Elowen said. "She just got overwhelmed." "Yeah." He pulled the empty sled without particular effort, the trail back up easier without the load. "You should have seen your face when she said she didn't take charity." "What about it? Like you were deciding between 3 different responses." She had been. "I went with the one that would work." "I noticed." A pause. "You're better at that than I am." "You're better at most of the physical things than I am," she said. "We balance." He was quiet for a moment. "We do," he said. They were back at the cabin by early afternoon, and the rest of the day was ordinary tasks: food, the fire, the trap equipment that needed work for the spring season. She thought about Agnes Brewster during the quiet parts of the evening, about the woman's particular pride, and the way it had almost cost her children a bad February. About the fine line between the self-sufficiency that kept you alive and the kind that made you refuse help until refusing was more dangerous than accepting. She'd been on the wrong side of that line herself. Not with Garrick, she'd been sensible enough to let him carry her out of the snow, some survival instinct overriding whatever pride she might have had. But in the months since, the ankle she'd said nothing about for 4 days. The times she'd pushed through something she should have acknowledged. The distance between asking for help and being weak was one she was still learning to navigate properly, and she didn't think she'd always get it right. March came in the way. March came tentatively at first, with false warmth and retreating snow, and then another week of cold before the real thaw began. The animals started moving differently, and the creek sounds changed, and Garrick watched all of it with the attention of someone reading a text in a language he'd been fluent in for decades. 6 weeks, he said one evening. To the pass, maybe 5. This year's moving faster than last. She looked at the fire. "I want to go down when it opens, stay a full week." Agnes Brewster first, then the other families Marin mentioned. "I know." He was working on a trap spring, the repetitive motion of testing and adjusting. "Take what you need from the soap stock. We'll be short for Abernathy." "He can wait. The families can't." She looked at him. He was looking at the trap, which was his way. "You're a good man," she said. He looked up. The directness of it seemed to surprise him, which surprised her. She would have thought by this point nothing she said caught him off guard. "I'm a practical man," he said. "You could have said Abernathy first." It would have been practical. He turned the trap spring in his hands. "Abernathy has money. The Brewsters don't." He set the spring down. "That's practical, too." She smiled. Not a big one. She wasn't a person of big smiles, but a real one, the kind that didn't ask his permission to exist. He caught it and looked away, and the corner of his jaw did the thing that meant he was holding down something he wasn't going to express out loud, and that was enough. The trading trip in late March was when the incident at the trading post happened. They'd been in Granger Creek 4 days. Elowen had spent 3 of those days working with Agnes Brewster, and the other families. Marin had identified 7 households in total, more than she'd planned for, requiring her to reorganize the teaching sessions to cover the most critical skills first and build from there. It was exhausting and exact work, Nothing like explaining to one person in one kitchen, more like managing a complicated piece of equipment that needed different calibration in every section. And by the fourth day, she was tired in the specific way that came from sustained social effort, which was not her natural element. They were at the trading post at the end of the fourth day, not Abernathy's general store, but a separate establishment at the far edge of the settlement, rougher, serving trailmen and trappers passing through. Garrick had business there with a man named Sutler about the guide arrangements for the following season. She'd come because the alternative was sitting alone in the boarding house, and she'd had enough of closed rooms. The place was loud. 3 separate groups of men, all in various stages of having been traveling too long and drinking enough to make them louder than they'd otherwise have been. She stood near the wall away from the bar and watched and didn't drink, because she didn't like losing the edge of her attention. And she was watching the room with the specific interest she'd developed over the past year for the way groups of people moved and maneuvered. Garrick was across the room with Sutler, deep in the kind of conversation that involved numbers and required concentration. She'd left him to it. The 2 men who separated from the group near the bar and started making their way toward her didn't look unusual at first. They were trailmen she'd developed a working taxonomy of the frontier male by now, and these were the standard version, cold-weathered and a little ragged, the look of people who'd been moving through hard country for a while. It was when they stopped 4 feet away, and the first one looked at her limp, and then at her face, that she understood the quality of what was coming. "You come with the big trapper," he said. He wasn't asking, because he didn't know she'd been with Garrick when they'd arrived. "I'm here with my husband, yes," she said. "Husband." He said it with the particular tone that put air quotes around it without using any. "Mountain woman." He looked at the limp again. "What's wrong with your leg?" "Nothing that concerns you," she said. He exchanged a look with the man beside him, the particular sideways communication of 2 people performing for each other. "Just wondering how He paused, choosing the word with the deliberateness of someone who wants to use a specific one. "How a cripple ended up with Voss." She looked at him. She'd had a year and a half of working out what she felt about the word and what she intended to do when someone used it, and she'd reached a clear position. The word was their problem, not hers, and what mattered was how she handled the moment that followed. "I'd imagine the same way most women end up with anyone," she said. "Choice." He didn't like the answer. He stepped closer, not threatening yet, but testing the boundary of personal space in the way men sometimes did when they wanted to see if you'd step back. "Funny walk you've got, I've noticed." He started, and Elowen moved. Not toward him, she moved sideways to the left, which put her at a different angle to both men, and her hand went to the rifle at her back, and she did not bring it up. She just put her hand on it. The second man saw the movement first. His expression changed. Then the room got quiet in the specific way. Rooms got quiet when something was about to happen, or had just been prevented from happening. Garrick was already moving. She could see him in her peripheral vision, coming across the room with the particular speed that his size made possible when he decided to use it. A large man who could cover ground fast when the occasion called for it. He put himself between her and the 2 men, which was both automatic and exactly wrong, because she was already handling it. And she put her hand on his arm without taking her other hand off the rifle. He stopped. He looked at her. She gave him a very small shake of her head, not yet, and looked back at the 2 men. The first one was reading the situation, which had shifted significantly from what he'd been calculating 30 seconds ago. There was a large and visibly unhappy man between them, and on the other side of that man was a woman with her hand on a rifle who had not stepped back once during the entire exchange. "Get away from my wife," Garrick said. He said it quietly, which was worse than shouting would have been. The first man's eyes moved between Garrick and Elowen, and then to the rifle she hadn't drawn, and back to Garrick's face. Whatever math he was doing, it came out unfavorable. He stepped back. His companion already had. They went back to their group. The room noise resumed, slightly too deliberately, everyone performing the act of having been absorbed in other things. Garrick turned to Elowen. He was still reading her. She could see him checking, the way he always checked after something went wrong or nearly went wrong. "You were handling it," he said. "Not a question." "I was handling it," she said. "I should have waited. You saw a man getting in my face." "I should have waited," he said again, more definitely. I saw what you were doing." He looked at the two men across the room. "I reacted before I thought." She looked at him. This was not a small thing. Garrick did not readily admit to reacting before thinking. It was connected to a deep part of his identity, the man who controlled his responses, who was never surprised into action. "It's all right," she said. "It's not all right that I stepped in without letting you finish." Garrick. She said his name with the specific weight she'd learned to put in it when she wanted him to actually hear what came next. "You stepped in because you saw someone you love being threatened. That's not wrong. The fact that I was already handling it is that's good information for next time." She looked at him steadily. "We're both still learning how to do this. It goes both ways." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I didn't want them to see you back down from anything." "I didn't back down from anything." "No," he said. "You didn't." Sutler appeared at Garrick's shoulder, a thin man with careful eyes who'd watched the whole thing from across the room and, to his credit, had not intervened or made anything of it. "Business still on, Voss?" "Business is still on," Garrick said, and went back across the room with Sutler. Elowen stood where she was for a moment. She looked at the two trailmen, who were very deliberately not looking at her. She looked at the room in general, the other drinkers and talkers and trailmen, some of whom were watching her sideways with the specific evaluation of people who just updated their assessment of something. Then she went and stood near the wall again and watched the room, same as before. On the walk back to the boarding house, Marin fell into step beside her. She'd been in the trading post. Elowen hadn't seen her there, but wasn't surprised. Marin seemed to be everywhere in Granger Creek without being conspicuous about it. "That was well handled," Marin said. "Which part?" "Both parts." She glanced sideways, him stopping when you touched his arm. "That's not a small thing." "No," Elowen said, "it isn't." They walked in silence for a moment. "Agnes is talking about you," Marin said. To the other women. "About what you taught her. She made soap last week first time." Elowen thought about Agnes's careful attention. The way she'd written down the proportions in the margin of a piece of old paper, pressing hard with the pencil to make sure it didn't fade. "She'll be good at it," she said. "She's already planning to sell some to Abernathy." Elowen smiled. "Good." They reached the boarding house. Marin stopped at the door and looked at Elowen with the expression she sometimes had, direct and assessing and not particularly sentimental. "You know what people in the settlement are saying about you and Voss?" "I can imagine. They're saying you're the ones to go to if you're in trouble on the mountain. Either of you. That you'll help if you can and you won't pretend otherwise." Marin paused. "That's a reputation that takes a long time to build." "You've built it in about a year and a half." Elowen thought about this. About the Brewsters and the soap and the rifle and the northeast corner and the ledger full of careful numbers. About a man who'd carried her out of the snow without ceremony and had not once, in all the time since, made her feel that carrying her had cost him anything he wasn't willing to spend. "We've both been building it," she said. "Together." Marin nodded. She went inside. Elowen stayed on the step for a moment. The settlement was quiet in the spring evening, a few lights, the sound of the smith's work dying down, the creek audible at the edge of everything, the same creek that ran from up high where the cabin was, tracing all the way down to here. She thought of Garrick inside, somewhere, working through the guide season numbers with Sutler, thinking about routes and weather and supply, the same mind that managed 100 practical details, and had once, in a cabin in February, chosen the words "I love you" with the same matter-of-fact economy he used for everything that was true. She went inside. The last morning in Granger Creek before the journey back up, a thing happened that she wouldn't understand the full significance of until weeks later. She was at Abernathy's store settling the soap accounts when the door opened, and two men came in who were not Granger Creek people. She knew most of the regulars by sight now, and these were trail-worn, distant, with the particular disorientation of people who'd been traveling a long time and had arrived somewhere unexpectedly. They were also thin, not trail lean but genuinely poorly thin, the kind that came from a bad season. She looked at them with the automatic assessment she'd developed. The older one was gray-bearded, thick-shouldered, with the look of a man who'd been physically powerful once and was carrying the ghost of that power in his frame, even as the frame itself had begun to fail. He moved with the particular stiffness of someone whose feet had been badly treated for a long time. The younger one was taller, rawer, with his father's shoulders and a face that reminded her, at a certain angle and in a certain light, of something she could not immediately locate. She looked at them, and they looked at the store and not at her, and she turned back to Abernathy and finished her transaction and left. She was 20 yards down the road when the thing she couldn't locate clicked into place. She stopped. She stood completely still in the middle of the Granger Creek Road, while the specific memory organized itself: a wagon, a frozen creek, a man who had assessed her against a list of costs and found her wanting. She was looking at the middle distance, at nothing. The man's beard had been brown. It was gray now. His shoulders had been wider. They were still wide, but the flesh had come off them, left something reduced. She told herself she could be wrong. She had been wrong about things before. But she stood on the road in the spring air and felt something cold settle into her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature, and she thought very clearly, I need to tell Garrick. She went to find him. She found Garrick at the south end of the settlement where the trail men tied their horses, finishing the last of the guide season conversation with Sutler. She waited until Sutler walked away, and then she said, I need to tell you something. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him give Sutler's retreating back no further attention. The two men who came into Abernathy's store just now, she said. The older one. I think it's my father. Garrick was quiet for a moment. You think, or you know? I'm not certain. He's older. He's lost weight. She looked at the ground, then back up. But the way he moves, his shoulders, she stopped. I know his shoulders. What do you want to do? That was what he asked. Not what do you think we should do? Not let me handle this. What do you want to do? She stood with that for a moment, feeling the weight of it, and also the cleanness of it, the respect embedded in the question. I want to know if I'm right, she said, and then I'll decide. They went back to Abernathy's store together. The two men were still there, the older one talking to Abernathy about trail conditions east of the settlement, the younger one looking at the goods on the shelves with the specific attention of someone calculating what they could afford. Elowen walked in and stood in the middle of the room and looked at the older man's face from the front, in full light, and she knew. Silas Harrow had aged a decade in 2 years. The gray had taken most of his beard and what was left of the hair at his temples. His coat was wrong for the season too light, patched at both elbows, and his boots were in bad shape, the left one wrapped with a strip of leather at the toe, where the sole had separated. He was talking to Abernathy with the particular energy of a man performing competence he didn't currently possess, the voice still carrying the authority of someone who expected to be listened to even when the circumstances didn't support it. The younger man turned from the shelf and saw her first. Dawson. His face went through 3 things in rapid succession recognition, something she could only call shame, and then a complicated stillness that was him deciding how to hold himself. He was thinner than she remembered. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there. He looked, she thought, like a man who'd spent 2 years being sorry about something and not knowing how to put it down. Silas registered the change in Dawson's posture and turned. He looked at her. She watched his face for the moment of recognition and saw it arrive not as guilt, not as relief, but as surprise, genuine and unguarded. The shock of a man who had genuinely not expected to see this particular person standing upright in a store in Montana, dressed for the frontier with a rifle on her back, and a man the size of a barn wall standing 1 step behind her left shoulder. Elowen, Silas said. He said everything with ownership in the syllables, the tone of a man addressing something that belonged to him or had once. Hello, father, she said. Abernathy had gone very still behind his counter. Dawson had not moved. Garrick stood where he was, and Elowen felt rather than saw his absolute stillness the specific quality of his attention that meant he was reading everything, and would not move unless she needed him to. Silas looked at Garrick, at the rifle on Elowen's back, at her limp, which his eyes went to with the automatic reflex she'd always hated, the assessment reflex, the one that had calculated her against the weight of the wagon and found her wanting. You're alive, he said. You sound surprised, she said. You shouldn't be. You left me enough to survive. She said it evenly, without heat. Barely enough. But enough, his jaw tightened, the pass was closing. The wagon couldn't— I know what your reasons were, she said. You explained them at the time. A silence in the store that had weight to it. Silas drew himself up. She knew this movement, had seen it her entire childhood, the gathering of authority. You're my daughter. Whatever happened, you're my blood, and I'm standing here telling you we need help. We've lost everything. Your mother— He stopped. I know about my mother, she said. The information had reached her through Marin months ago. A trail man passing through had brought word of a woman named Harrow, dying of fever in the Western Territories 2 seasons back. She'd sat with the news for a long time. She'd felt it. She'd felt it in the particular way of something that had already half happened in her mind, long before it became fact. I know she's gone. Something moved across Silas's face. Whether it was grief or something he wanted her to interpret as grief, she couldn't be certain, and that uncertainty told her something important about how well she still knew him. Then you understand, he said. We have no one. Dawson and I came west thinking the land claim was gone by the time we got there. Jumped by someone with better paperwork. He looked at the store, at the goods on the shelves, at her. We need shelter. We need food to get through to summer. You're my daughter. I'm asking you for help. You're not asking, she said. You're telling me I owe it to you. His eyes sharpened. You're my blood. You left me in the snow, she said. Not with anger. She'd expected the anger to come, and it didn't. Not the hot kind. What was there instead was something colder and more settled. You left me with 1 blanket and a tin cup. You calculated whether I was worth carrying, and you decided I wasn't, and you drove away. She held his eyes. I understand why you did it. I even understand that you probably believed the reasons you told yourself. But understanding it doesn't make it something I owe you for. Silas's face had gone a particular color. I am your father. You were, she said. Dawson made a sound, not a word. Just a sound, low and involuntary. The sound of someone absorbing something they already knew but hadn't heard said out loud. Silas took a step toward her. Garrick moved not much, just enough, shifting his weight fractionally forward, and Silas stopped. You'd let your own father stand in the cold, Silas said, and his voice had found the register she remembered from childhood, the one that was supposed to produce guilt by sheer force of expectation. I'm not letting you stand in the cold, she said. I'm telling you the truth about what we are to each other. She looked at him steadily. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you and Dawson enough food to get to the next settlement east. 2 days of travel if the weather holds. I'll talk to Abernathy about basic supplies. He'll put it on account, and I'll settle it. She paused. That's more than you left me. Silas stared at her. That's all? That's all. She looked at Dawson. Is there anything you want to say? Dawson had been looking at the floor. He raised his eyes. They were the same eyes she remembered her brother's eyes, brown and direct when they weren't deliberately avoiding her, which was what they'd done on a trail in the snow 2 years ago. I'm sorry, he said. Elowen, I've been— He stopped. There's no way to say it that makes it enough. No, she agreed. There isn't. I stood there, he said. I didn't say anything, and I didn't do anything, and I've been carrying that since the mountain. She looked at her brother. The shame on his face was real. She could tell the difference between performed emotion and the kind that lived in the body, and what Dawson was carrying lived in his body. It had been living there for 2 years. She could see it in the lines around his eyes, in the way he held his shoulders as if bracing for something that was going to hit him. I know, she said. I believe you. She paused. That matters. It doesn't change what happened, but it matters. Dawson nodded. He looked like he wanted to say more and understood there wasn't more to say. Silas had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man who'd lost control of a situation he'd expected to control. So that's it, he said. 2 days of food, and we're dismissed. You're not dismissed, Elowen said. You're given what you need and given a direction. What you do with both of those things is your business. She looked at him one last time, at the man who had made her, in both senses of the word, the making of her body and the making of who she'd had to become. Go east, father. Get to the settlement there. Find work if you can. Stay away from high country in winter if you can help it. She paused. Don't come back here expecting authority over my life. That's the one thing I won't give you. Silas Harrow looked at his daughter for a long moment. She watched him work through it, the outrage, the calculation, the assessment of whether there was any leverage remaining. She watched him find that there wasn't. The woman standing in front of him was not the injured girl he'd left at a frozen creek. She had a rifle and a husband and a reputation in this settlement.
And the particular stillness of someone who had already survived the worst thing he could have done to her and built a life from the other side of it.
He had nothing to offer and nothing to threaten. He straightened his coat. He looked at Garrick once more, the long look of a man trying to impose significance on a situation where he had none. Garrick looked back at him with the pale gray eyes that had never in Elowen's experience shown anything they weren't meant to show, and said nothing. Silas walked to the door. He opened it. He stopped. For a moment she thought he was going to say something that would change the shape of the conversation, some acknowledgement, some cracking of the surface. She waited. He walked out. The door closed. Dawson hadn't moved. He was still looking at her with the expression of someone who was deciding whether they had the right to ask for more than they'd been given. "Come with me to Abernathy," she said. "I'll get you 2 days of supplies and tell you the best route east." She paused. "You'll make it. The weather's good. Elowen." He said her name with the specific difficulty of someone using it carefully. "The man who found you, who took you in." He looked at Garrick. He stopped. Tried again. "Were you all right after?" "I'm all right now," she said. "That's the part that counts." Dawson looked at Garrick again. Garrick met his eyes and held them for a moment, and whatever passed between the two men in that look was brief and complete. The particular communication of people who are both, in different ways, assessing what kind of man is standing in front of them. Then Garrick said, "She did most of it herself." Dawson looked at his sister. The shame on his face shifted slightly, not gone. It was never going to be gone. She understood that and thought maybe it shouldn't be, but somewhere in it was something else, something that looked almost like the recognition of who she'd become. "I can see that," he said quietly. She took Dawson to Abernathy and settled the account and gave him the route. She stood at the edge of the settlement and watched him go after his father, the two of them moving east down the trail, and she watched until they were small and then gone. Garrick stood beside her. He didn't say anything for a long time. "You gave them more than they deserve," he said finally. "I gave them what I could live with giving," she said. "That's not the same thing." He thought about this. "No," he said. "It's not." She looked east, at the trail where her father and brother had disappeared. She thought about the woman she'd been at the beginning of that trail on a wagon, with a family she'd believed would not leave her, heading somewhere she'd thought would be better. She thought about a frozen creek and a tin cup, and snow coming down in the particular indifferent way of a mountain that had no opinion about whether she survived. She thought about footsteps, heavy, deliberate ones, coming through the snow toward the pine trees where she'd dragged herself 15 yards on a broken ankle, because she'd decided she wasn't done yet. "I don't feel what I expected to feel," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. More." She looked at the mountains. "I thought seeing him would be larger. I thought I'd be angrier, or more relieved, or that something would be resolved in a way I could feel." She paused. It just felt like completing a task, like fixing the northeast corner. Garrick made a sound that was nearly a laugh. Just nearly. "That's not the worst thing it could feel like." "No," she agreed. "It's not." They turned back toward the boarding house. She watched her walk the irregular roll of it, the slight drop on the right side, the particular signature she'd been leaving in ground for 2 years, and had stopped thinking about as a deficiency, and had started thinking about as just the way she moved. She'd stopped hiding it somewhere around her first winter on the mountain, without quite deciding to. It had just become part of how she was. She still thought about it sometimes. Not with grief, exactly. More with the complicated honesty of someone who understood that a thing can be both a loss and a formation, that what breaks you and what makes you can be the same event seen from different distances. That was the thing nobody had told her about surviving. Not the survival part that was just stubbornness and cold math and one foot in front of the other. It was what came after. The way the thing you'd survived became part of the structure of you, integrated into how you stood and how you moved and what you understood about the weight of promises and the price of safety and the specific, irreplaceable value of being seen clearly by someone and not found wanting. Garrick had seen her clearly from the beginning. Not kindly, that wasn't how he was built, but accurately. He had looked at a woman in the snow and seen what she was trying to do, not what she'd failed to manage, and he'd made his decision accordingly. She had spent the time since doing her best to be worth that decision, and she'd come to understand, slowly, that being worth it wasn't the right frame. That she didn't owe him her worth the way a debt was owed. That he hadn't saved her as an investment. He'd saved her because leaving her there was something he wasn't capable of. There was a difference. It had taken her most of 2 years to feel it fully. They went back up the mountain the next morning. The trail was clear, the weather held, and they made good time despite the load. She was stronger than she'd been the first time she'd made this climb. She knew it in the way her body used the slope, the efficiency of it. Nothing wasted. The ankle was what it was. It had been what it was for 2 years, and she expected it would continue to be what it was, and she had stopped expecting it to be otherwise. At the top of the last hard climb, where the trail leveled before the final run to the cabin, she stopped. Not because she needed to. Her lungs were fine, her legs were fine, but because she wanted to. She turned and looked back down at the valley, at Granger Creek, small and specific in the distance, at the trail they'd come up, at the country she'd been learning for 2 years. Its patterns and its moods and its particular vocabulary of weather and animal and light. She could read it now. Not perfectly, she'd never read it with the bone-deep fluency that Garrick had spent 30 years building. But she could read it. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "Everything," she said. He stood beside her and looked too, and for a while they just stood there on the trail in the April air with the valley below them and the mountain above them, and neither of them said anything, because they'd gotten very good at knowing when the silence was sufficient. The cabin was as they'd left it. She went in first, the way she usually did when they'd been away, checking the fire, checking the water barrel, doing the inventory that had become automatic. Garrick brought in the packs. That evening she sat by the fire with the ledger open on her knee, updating the season's numbers, and Garrick sat at the table with a trap mechanism he'd been meaning to repair since February. The fire moved. Outside, the mountain was doing its spring things, the creek loud with melt, the pines releasing their particular smell when the temperature warmed, the specific bird sound that told her what the next few days of weather would do. She thought about Agnes Brewster making soap in her kitchen in Granger Creek, pressing the proportions into the margin of an old piece of paper. She thought about Maren Tolliver's direct eyes and the particular friendship they'd built, careful and honest and without pretense. She thought about Dawson's face when she'd said, "I believe you," and the way his shoulders had changed when she said it, some impossible weight not lifted but acknowledged, which was the only movement possible. She thought about a man who had looked at her calculations in a ledger and said, "The families can't wait." She thought about November firelight and a conversation about a wall cavity. She thought about the specific word partners spoken on a cold October afternoon and everything that had come after it. She looked at her ankle, the scar along the outside of it where the bone had pushed against the skin before it healed. The slight wrongness in the line of her foot, the way her boot wore unevenly on the inside edge. She put her hand on it for a moment, just put her hand there. Some things healed true, and some things healed wrong, and some things healed into something different from what they'd been, which was its own kind of true. She'd learned that there was no point in mourning the shape you would have been if nothing bad had happened to you. That person didn't exist. The person who existed was the one who'd been through the thing and come out on the other side with the specific knowledge and the specific scars and the specific understanding that only the experience of surviving it could give you. She was not grateful for the frozen creek or the tin cup or the blank face of her father driving away. She did not believe it had happened for a reason, or that suffering built character in any way that made the suffering acceptable. She believed that terrible things happened, and that you either let them finish you or you found something to build from the rubble, and that the building was entirely up to you, and that what you built could be real and solid and worth having, even if the material it came from was broken. That was the thing she'd learned on this mountain that she hadn't known before. Not that she was strong. She'd always been stubborn, which was not the same thing. Not that she could survive. Survival was mostly mechanics, mostly the refusal to stop when the logical thing was to stop. What she'd learned was that what she built from her survival could become something she actually chose, not just endured. chose. She had chosen this. She had chosen this man and this mountain and this life, and she had chosen it again and again as she came to understand more fully what she was choosing, and she intended to keep choosing it. Garrick, she said. He looked up from the trap mechanism. Nothing, she said. I just wanted to say your name. He looked at her for a moment with those gray eyes that she could read now, mostly not perfectly. There were still layers she hadn't mapped, and she thought there always would be, which was fine, which was actually one of her favorite things about him. All right, he said, and went back to the trap. She went back to the ledger. The fire kept going. The mountain kept being the mountain. And in the spring of 1880, in a rough-hewn cabin on a Montana high country slope, a woman with a limp and a rifle and a ledger full of careful numbers sat beside a fire she'd built and kept, and understood that she had arrived not at the destination her family had been driving toward when they left her behind, but at something far more specific and far more real. At the life she had built herself, from the wreckage of the one they'd taken from her. At the knowledge that family was not blood, and blood was not loyalty, and loyalty was not obligation, but choice, the specific, repeated, deliberate choice to stay, to not leave, to decide again and again that the person beside you was worth the cold, and the work, and the long silences, and the arguments about East trap lines, and everything else that came with choosing someone fully instead of performing the choice. When it was easy and abandoning it when it wasn't. She had been left behind in the snow. She had not stayed there. And the woman she'd become because of it, and in spite of it, was the only woman she'd ever wanted to be.